Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still don't like talking about what happened at Higgins Lake. It's been over 60 years, but I can still feel those eyes on me. My husband George has been gone for almost a decade now, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and want to ask him if he remembers that Labor Day weekend in '59, if he felt what I felt, if he believed me. George and I loved camping. We weren't fancy people, just a basic tent, our Coleman stove, and enough supplies to enjoy nature for a few days. British Columbia was beautiful in late summer, and Higgins Lake was our favorite spot. Remote enough that we'd only run into a handful of other campers, if any. That year, we hadn't seen a soul for 5 days straight. The first 4 days were perfect. We'd wake with the sun, make coffee over the campfire, spend our days fishing or hiking around the lake. George would read his Louis L'Amour westerns, and I'd sketch the landscape. That's what we did. Simple pleasures, just us and nature. Our campsite was in a small clearing about 50 yards from the lake's edge, surrounded by pine trees and wild huckleberry bushes. We'd picked our spot carefully, making sure it was flat enough for comfortable sleeping, but near enough to the water to hear the gentle lapping against the shore at night. It was our last evening, Labor Day Monday. We'd planned to head home the next morning. I remember thinking how I wasn't ready to go back to our little house in Vancouver, back to my secretarial job and George's work at the lumber mill. These wilderness breaks kept us sane. Around 7:30 that evening, as the light was starting to soften, but before true dusk set in, I told George I was going to gather some kindling for our final campfire. We'd been using the same fallen branches near our site for days, and the pickings were getting slim. I figured I'd venture out just a bit further to find some good dry wood. "Don't go too far, Ellie," George said, barely looking up from his book. Dinner in 30. I grabbed our wicker basket and walked about 100 yards from the campsite, toward a thicker stand of trees where I figured there'd be plenty of fallen branches. I was humming to myself. Mac the Knife, I think. It had been playing on the radio constantly that summer. I'd been gathering wood for maybe 10 minutes, my basket half full of perfect kindling pieces, when it happened. It wasn't a sound that alerted me. It was a feeling, like when you're alone in a room and suddenly realize you're not. The hairs on my arms stood up before my brain even registered what was happening. I froze mid-bend, my fingers inches away from a nice dry branch. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, not like when you feel someone's casual glance, but like being studied, examined. I straightened up slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away stood a small knoll with a large pine tree. The lower branches hung down, creating a partial screen. Behind those branches, half hidden but unmistakably there, was a figure. My first thought was that another camper had wandered into our area. But as I focused on the shape, I realized this was no human, at least not any human I'd ever seen. It was tall, well over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7 or 8, impossibly broad in the shoulders and chest, and it was covered in hair, not clothing, but actual hair, a rusty brown color that lightened around what I guessed was its chest area. The hair wasn't matted or tangled like you'd expect from an animal that lived in the woods. It looked maintained somehow. I couldn't make out its legs clearly through the branches, but I could see its face. God, that face. It had a sloped forehead that angled back sharply, not round like a person's. Parts of its face didn't have hair. The cheeks and around what passed for a nose, which wasn't really a nose at all, but just a flat area with 2 dark holes. Its mouth was barely there, just a thin slit below those nostrils. But the eyes are what still wake me up at night. Deep set under heavy brow ridges, they were watching me with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Not animal curiosity, understanding, awareness, recognition, almost like it knew exactly what I was, while I had no idea what it could be. Neither of us moved. I don't know how long we stood there. It felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. It didn't make a sound, didn't gesture, just watched me with those knowing eyes. I dropped my basket without realizing it. Kindling scattered around my feet. Slowly, without taking my eyes off the figure, I started backing away. 1 step, 2 steps. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth had gone completely dry. The creature didn't follow. It didn't move at all, just tracked me with those eyes as I retreated. When I'd backed up about 20 feet, I finally turned and walked quickly, not running, though every instinct screamed at me to sprint, back toward our campsite. When I reached our clearing, George was tending the fire we already had going. He looked up and immediately frowned. "Ellie, where's the kindling, and why are you white as a ghost?" I couldn't tell him. Not yet. I just shook my head and said I wasn't feeling well. Maybe something I ate. George was concerned, but didn't press it. That was his way, give me space when I needed it. I sat in our folding canvas chair, hands trembling as I clutched my enamel coffee cup. I kept looking back toward the trees where I'd seen it, half expecting to see that tall figure emerge from the forest, walking straight into our camp. But nothing came. We ate dinner. Bacon and beans, I remember, though I couldn't stomach more than a few bites. George talked about the fish he'd caught that morning, how he'd release the little ones back to grow up and give someone else a good fight someday. Normal conversation, safe conversation, all while my mind raced with what I'd seen. As darkness fell completely and George built up the fire for the evening, the feeling came over me again. Not the watched feeling, something different, an urgency, a deep, primitive certainty that we needed to leave. Not in the morning as planned, but right now. The sense was so powerful it made me dizzy. "George," I finally said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "I think we should pack up tonight. Leave at first light." He looked at me across the fire, his face half in shadow. "What's going on, Ellie? You've been acting strange since you went for kindling." So I told him. Everything. The feeling of being watched. The figure behind the tree. The intelligent eyes, the rusty hair, the flat non-nose. As I described it, I kept my voice low, as if the creature might be just beyond the firelight, listening. I expected George to laugh it off, to tell me it was probably just another hiker or my imagination running wild, to dismiss it entirely. But he didn't. Instead, he got very quiet. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the night sky. Then he said something that chilled me more than my own experience had. "While you were gone getting wood, I had the strangest feeling come over me, like we needed to leave tomorrow, no reason for it. Nothing happened, just this knowing. I was going to suggest we head out early, but I didn't want to seem foolish." We stared at each other across the fire. Two rational adults who just admitted to having the same irrational feeling, independent of each other. And now I'd seen something that defied explanation. "We'll leave at dawn," George said finally. "Get some sleep. I'll keep the fire going a bit longer." I didn't sleep. Not really. I dozed fitfully in our tent, jerking awake at every small sound from the forest around us, the hooting of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine needles. Once, a crack of a branch that had me sitting bolt upright, straining to listen for footsteps that never came. When the sky finally began to lighten, I was already dressed and rolling up our sleeping bags. George didn't comment on my haste, just methodically helped break down our camp. We worked in near silence, moving with an efficiency born of practice, and now, fear. We'd taken down the tent and were collapsing the final poles when we heard it. The sound of feet, large, heavy feet running through the underbrush, not directly toward us, but in a wide arc, like something circling our camp and then moving away. The footfalls were spaced too far apart to be human, moving at a speed that seemed impossible given the density of the forest. George and I froze, the tent poles forgotten in our hands. The running continued, gradually growing fainter, until it disappeared completely. We looked at each other, and without a word, began packing twice as fast. "Did you see anything?" I whispered as we loaded the last of our gear into our station wagon. George shook his head. "No, just heard it." He hesitated. "Whatever it was big, Ellie, really big." We drove away from Hidden Lake as the sun was fully cresting the horizon. I kept looking in the side mirror, watching our campsite disappear around the bend, half expecting to see a large, hair-covered figure emerge from the trees and watch us go. When we got home, George suggested we not talk about what happened. "People will think we're crazy," he said, "or attention-seeking, or both." I agreed, though I did write it all down in my journal that night, not wanting to forget a single detail. A few years later, I read about Bigfoot in the papers, saw the grainy Peterson Gimlin film footage from California. The creature in that film walked differently than what I saw, more hunched, but the rusty hair color was the same, the massive height and build, the sloped forehead. George and I never went back to Hidden Lake. We found other camping spots, always more populated, always with other people nearby. And we never stayed more than 3 nights in any one place. I'm an old woman now. My grandchildren think my camping stories are boring compared to their video games and smartphones. I've never told them about Hidden Lake, never tried to explain that feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist, never described those intelligent eyes studying me from behind pine branches. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, if it remembers the woman who stood frozen with a basket of kindling, staring back at it in terror and wonder. If it waits for campers to stay just a little too long in its territory before making them feel that inexplicable urge to leave. I'll never know what it was. A creature science hasn't classified. A being from somewhere else? A guardian of that quiet lake? Whatever it was, it let us go. It could have attacked, I'm certain of that. But instead, it watched. It waited. And when we finally got the message that we'd overstayed our welcome, it ran away, as if to confirm we'd made the right choice. I've never felt anything like that urgent need to leave, before or since. Sometimes I think George and I were lucky. Whatever happened at Hidden Lake in September 1959 remains unexplained. But one thing I know for certain. Something was there in those woods. Something watched me, something intelligent, something other. And sometimes even now I still feel like I'm being watched. Story 2. I've debated whether to write this out or not for years, and even now my hands are shaking typing this. I've told a few people in person, but they either think I'm crazy or just making stuff up. So here goes, the full story of what happened to me back in July 1995. It was the 4th of July weekend, and I'd taken my baby daughter Emma to visit her grandmother in Whatcom County, Washington. Emma was just 9 months old then, still so tiny in her car seat. The visit went longer than I planned. My mother-in-law always wants just 5 more minutes with the baby, and before I knew it, it was dark when we started heading home. Around 11 p.m., I was driving my old Honda Civic. You know, nothing fancy, just a reliable 4-door that got decent gas mileage. Emma had finally fallen asleep in her car seat behind me after fussing most of the drive. I remember being exhausted but relieved she was finally quiet. There's this stretch of road I've driven 100 times between my mum-in-law's place and our house. It has this sharp corner with a guardrail on the right side where there's a drop-off into a small gully with a creek running through it. Not a major cliff or anything, but enough that they needed the guardrail. I was taking the curve at about 35 km/h. I specifically remember checking my speed because I always slow down there, especially with Emma in the car. My headlights were sweeping across the guardrail posts as I turned, and that's when I first noticed something off. At first, I thought maybe it was just part of the guardrail, or possibly a telephone pole. But as I got closer, I realized there was something perched or crouched on the last cement guardrail post. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was just this dark shape that didn't belong there. Then it moved, and everything changed. This thing stood up from its crouching position and literally jumped into the middle of my lane. It happened so fast. 1 second it's on the guardrail, the next it's directly in front of my car, with its arms raised high above its head. I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was tall. I'd estimate at least 8 feet, maybe taller. It was completely black, like shadow black, not just dark-colored. And it was definitely not a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in Washington. This was nothing like that. Its arms stretched up like a human's would, not like a bear's front legs. And its face, God, its face was more man-like than animal, but not human either. I didn't have time to stop. I was maybe 15 feet away when it jumped in front of me. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I just froze. I didn't hit the brakes. I didn't swerve. I just drove straight ahead because everything happened so fast. Then the weirdest thing happened. When this creature realized I wasn't stopping, it actually laid down on the road right in front of me, like it deliberately positioned itself so my car would drive over it. Who does that? What animal does that? I drove right over it. I felt and heard these loud booms as each tire went over whatever it was. Thump, 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 thump. 4 distinct impacts, 1 for each tire. The whole car shook. Emma startled awake and started crying. I was crying too by then, completely terrified. For a split second, I considered stopping to see if it was alive, to see what it actually was. But then I thought about Emma in the back seat and about being alone on a dark road with whatever that thing was. What if it wasn't dead? What if there were more of them? So I kept driving. I drove the remaining 20 minutes home, sobbing the whole way. I was convinced I'd just killed a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds, believe me. I've spent years questioning what I saw, but that's what my brain kept screaming at me as I drove. You just ran over a Bigfoot. When I got home, the house was empty. There was a note on the fridge from my husband saying he and the older kids had gone with his brother to Canada for the weekend. I'd completely forgotten they were going to do that. So it was just me and Emma, and I was completely freaking out. I put Emma to bed. Amazingly, she fell back asleep quickly, and then I called 911. I didn't tell them I thought I'd hit a Bigfoot because I didn't want them thinking I was crazy or drunk or something. I just said I thought I'd hit a bear on the road and gave them the location. The dispatcher asked if I needed assistance, and I said no, I was home safe, but thought someone should check if the animal was injured or blocking the road. They said they'd send someone to check it out. After I hung up, I went outside with a flashlight to look at my car. I expected major damage. This thing was huge, but there was hardly anything wrong with the car. The plastic license plate holder was broken, and there was some strange hair caught on one of the license plate bolts. That was it. No dents, no blood, nothing else. My dogs were acting weird, though. We had 2 labs at the time, and they kept circling the car, sniffing the undercarriage and whining. They wouldn't come when I called them. That freaked me out even more. I reached down and pulled off some of the hair that was stuck on the license plate. It was dark brown with these reddish highlights, really coarse and wiry, not like human hair at all, and not like any animal fur I was familiar with. It was maybe 4 or 5 inches long. I remember standing there under the porch light, examining it, and then getting completely overwhelmed by fear. I threw it away in the outside garbage can because I just wanted it gone. This was years before DNA testing was common, and I've kicked myself 100 times since for not keeping it. I barely slept that night. I kept the lights on and checked on Emma every hour. I was convinced something was going to come to our house, looking for revenge or something. Nothing did, but I jumped at every noise. When my husband and kids came home the next day, I tried to tell them what happened. My husband gave me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to decide if you're joking or losing your mind. He said I probably hit a deer, and my imagination ran wild because I was tired. But I know what deer look like. This wasn't that. The weird thing is, when I called 911 again the next day to find out if they'd found anything, they had no record of my call. Nothing. The operator checked twice and said there was no report filed about any animal collision on that road. That didn't make sense. I convinced my brother to go with me to the spot later that day. I wanted to find evidence. Hair, blood, something to prove I wasn't crazy. We searched the road and the gully below the guardrail. We found absolutely nothing. No blood, no hair, not even the piece of my license plate holder that broke off. It was like it never happened. For weeks afterward, I avoided that road. I took the long way around to get to my mother-in-law's house. When I finally drove that route again, in broad daylight with my husband, I couldn't even pinpoint exactly where it happened. All the guardrail posts looked the same. I've tried researching similar encounters since then. This was before the internet was big, so it was mostly library books, and eventually some online forums years later. I found some stories that have similarities, but nothing exactly like what I experienced. The strangest part? A few times over the years, maybe 3 or 4 times total, I've heard these weird cries at night. They don't sound like any animal I know, not coyotes or cougars or anything native to this area. They're these long, almost mournful howls that make the hair on my arms stand up. The first time I heard it, Emma was about 4 years old, so around 1999. The most recent was just last year. It's always distant, like it's coming from the woods beyond our property, but I swear it's the same, whatever it is. I've never seen another one, though. I've questioned myself 1,000,000 times about what happened that night. Was it really a Bigfoot? Was I just tired and saw something else? But I can't explain why it stood up, why it deliberately laid down in front of my car, or why there was no evidence afterward. Sometimes I wonder if it survived somehow, and that's what I hear crying in the distance. Or maybe it's looking for the one I hit. Emma's in college now, and she rolls her eyes whenever I bring this up. She was too young to remember it, of course. My husband still thinks I hit a deer and invented the rest. Nobody believes me. I've mostly stopped talking about it, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt when my car drove over it, and sometimes when I hear those cries in the night, I lock the doors and windows just in case. Story 3. I still get goosebumps when I think about that night, June 20th, 1975. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. I was 28 then, making the same drive I did every Friday night. From Fort Lauderdale down to Homestead Air Force Base to spend the weekend with my husband who was stationed there. My son Tommy was 6, and I had my niece Carla and nephew Michael with me too, both around 8 or 9 years old. It was well after 10 p.m. as I drove south on Highway 27. If you've never been on that stretch of road back then, you can't imagine how isolated it was. 2 narrow lanes bordered by deep canals on both sides, cutting right along the edge of the Everglades. No streetlights, no buildings, no gas stations, just miles of dark swampland stretching out forever. The only light came from my Ford Pinto's high beams cutting through the pitch-black night. The kids had dozed off in the back of my station wagon. Tommy was curled up on the back seat, and my niece and nephew were sprawled out in the cargo area on blankets and pillows I'd set up for them. The radio was playing softly. I think it was that song Love Will Keep Us Together by Captain and Tennerly that was big that summer. I remember because it cut out with static as we got further from town. I was about halfway through the drive, somewhere south of Tamiamitrai, in that area locals called Crow Mavenue. There was literally nothing out there. just the canal water gleaming occasionally in my headlights, tall sawgrass beyond it, and the massive Everglades dike looming on the western side. No other cars for miles. The windows were cracked open, and I could hear the chorus of frogs and insects from the swamp. The air was thick with humidity. You know how Florida gets in June, like breathing through a wet towel. I wasn't going very fast, maybe 45 or 50 Mapichin. You couldn't on that road. It was too narrow and winding, and hitting a gator or deer was a real possibility. I'd made this drive dozens of times, so I was alert but comfortable. Just thinking about seeing my husband Tom the next morning, planning our weekend, wondering if we'd take the kids to the beach if the weather held up. That's when I saw it. Movement on the right side of the road caught my eye. Something coming up out of the canal. At first, I thought it was a bear. We occasionally saw them out there, though they usually stuck deeper in the glades. I slowed down immediately, easing off the gas and tapping the brake. Whatever it was seemed to be on all fours, pulling itself up onto the gravel shoulder. It was big. That was my first thought. Too big for a deer, maybe even bigger than a black bear. I slowed to about 15 mph, not wanting to hit it. My headlights were illuminating it directly now, and something wasn't right. The shape was wrong somehow. That's when it stood up. God, I still get chills. It just unfurled itself, rising up from all fours to stand completely upright. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. This figure was enormous. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been around 8 feet tall. It had broad shoulders and a massive build, like a football player with all their gear on, but bigger, and it was covered, head to toe, in this shaggy, mossy brown hair. The hair wasn't jet black like you'd expect from a bear. It was this strange, dead palm frond color, maybe 4 or 5 inches long all over its body. I'd slowed almost to a complete stop at this point, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, stepped out into the road directly in front of my car, walking on 2 legs. It moved, purposefully, not stumbling or awkward like a bear trying to walk upright. It swung its arms naturally, like a person would. It crossed right in front of my headlights, and I could see it so clearly. The thick neck, the broad, hunched shoulders, the way the hair hung from its arms. It was maybe 15 feet in front of me, fully illuminated in my high beams. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget that moment. Our eyes met. It had dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge. The face was not quite human, but not like any animal I'd ever seen either. There was intelligence there, and surprise. Like it was just as shocked to see me as I was to see it. For a few seconds, couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't even sure my heart was beating. The whole world narrowed down to just me and this being looking at each other through my windshield. Then it broke the spell. It glanced down, as if suddenly self-conscious, turned away from my car and walked, not ran, but walked, off the road and back down toward the canal on the other side. I watched, completely frozen, as it disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for I don't know how long, my hands shaking on the wheel. The kids were still asleep, completely unaware. The only sound was the idle of the Pinto's engine and my own ragged breathing. I've never experienced anything like the fear that washed over me once I processed what I'd just seen. It wasn't panic exactly, more like a profound disorientation, like the world had suddenly tilted sideways and nothing made sense anymore. I kept thinking I should back up, turn around, drive the other way, but there was nowhere to go. Just miles of dark, empty road in either direction. Finally, I took a deep breath, put the car in gear, and slowly started driving again. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. My mind was racing. Should I report this? Who would I even tell? Who would believe me? As I drove, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I'd grown up on Ontario Island, raised with my Native American heritage. We had stories of strange creatures in the woods, but nothing like this. I'd never heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Those weren't part of our traditions. To me, it was just a hairy man. That's what I called it in my head. A giant, hairy man who had crawled out of the Everglades. The rest of the drive is a blur. I know I made it to the base because I remember the relief I felt seeing the guard gate, the lights, other people. I remember my husband greeting us as I pulled up to our weekend housing, asking if I was okay because I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't tell him then. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe such a crazy story? The kids never knew. They slept through the whole thing. For years I kept it to myself, only occasionally mentioning it to my sister, who I'm sure thought I was exaggerating or had seen a bear in the darkness. It wasn't until years later, in the 80s, that I heard someone talking about skunk apes in the Everglades. When they described what they looked like, my blood ran cold. That was it. That was what I had seen. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person in a costume? But who would be out there, in the middle of nowhere at that time of night? And no costume could capture that natural movement, that authentic surprise in its eyes. A bear? No way. I know what bears look like. This walked upright with complete ease. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. Here's what haunts me most, that brief moment when our eyes met. There was recognition there, not like it knew me personally, but like two intelligent beings acknowledging each other's existence. I never felt threatened. If anything, it seemed more cautious of me than I was of it. The area is all developed now. That stretch of Highway 27 has been widened, built up. The wilderness has been pushed back. I wonder sometimes if it's still out there, deeper in the glades, watching the encroachment of our world into its domain. Or if maybe it was the last of its kind, and I was one of the few people lucky, or unlucky, enough to see it. I've never gone public with this story before. My niece has heard me tell it over the years, and I know she recently spoke with some investigator about it. Part of me wishes she hadn't. Another part is relieved that someone else might know that these things exist, because I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't my imagination. It's been almost 50 years now, and I've never seen anything like it again, but I still can't drive that road at night, and whenever I'm near the Everglades and hear the frogs and insects go suddenly silent, I wonder if it's out there, watching from the darkness. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me through my windshield. And I wonder if, somewhere in the depths of the Everglades, that creature remembers me too. Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 6 years now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me since it happened, and I still think about it almost every day. This happened in spring 2017 near Higgins Lake in Michigan. I own a small cabin there that's been in my family since my grandfather built it in the 60s. Nothing fancy, just a getaway spot where I've been taking my twin daughters since they were little. Jessica and Amanda were 18 at the time, and they still loved coming up to the cabin, even though they were getting ready for college. That particular weekend, we were working on building a new fire pit. The old one was falling apart, and we needed some decent-sized rocks to make a proper ring. There were plenty of good rocks scattered throughout the woods on my property, but we decided to drive down some of the 2 tracks to look for some bigger ones we could haul back in my pickup. It was drizzling that day, not pouring, just that annoying light rain that makes everything damp. The girls wanted to go anyway, so we hopped in my F-150 and started exploring some of the back trails I was familiar with. I've been hunting these woods for 20+ years, so I know the area pretty well. We were about 2 miles from the cabin, bumping along this overgrown 2-track. The forest was getting thick on both sides. Lots of old growth trees, underbrush, the usual Michigan woodland. The trail went up a small ridge, nothing major, maybe a 30-foot rise. As we crested it, that's when everything changed. I had to slam on the brakes. Something massive, and I mean massive, sprinted across the trail about 50 yards ahead of us. My first thought, as crazy as it sounds, was, that's a person in a suit. But within half a second, I knew that was impossible. No human moves like that. No costume looks like that. It was covered in long black hair, not fur exactly, more like hair, shaggy and matted in some spots. The thing that stood out most was this patch of white hair between its shoulder blades, almost like a birthmark. It was running in this forward-leaning position, arms swinging, but the arms were so long they almost touched the ground with each stride. I've never seen anything move that fast through the woods. It cleared the entire width of the trail in maybe 3 strides. Amanda screamed. Jessica was completely silent, just gripping the door handles so tight her knuckles were white. I remember my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The girls started talking at once, but I shushed them because there was something else. A large grey wolf was running about 15 feet behind the creature. I recognized this wolf. I'd seen tracks from him around my property for years, distinctive paw prints about 5.5 inches across. I'd spotted him a few times at a distance. He was a big male, probably 120 pounds. But next to this thing, he looked like a puppy. The creature was pulling away from the wolf as they disappeared up the hillside on the other side of the track. That's what really got me. Whatever this thing was, it was outrunning a wolf. A wolf. Those things can hit 35 mph, and this creature was making the wolf look slow. I finally found my voice and asked the girls if they'd seen what I'd seen. They were both pale and nodding. Amanda was crying a little, and Jessica just kept saying, "What the fuck, Dad? What the actual fuck was that?" I tried to be rational. "Maybe it was a bear," I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. I've hunted bear. I know what they look like running. This wasn't a bear. When it ran, you could see the muscle definition through the hair. The hair on its body and back was longer than the hair on its head and arms, and the proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was bipedal the entire time, never dropped to all fours. I put the truck in gear and drove up to where it had crossed. I wanted to see if I could spot where it went. The girls begged me not to get out, so I didn't. We drove as far as we could up the hillside on an old logging trail, but there was nothing to see. Whatever it was gone. The creature must have been at least 9 feet tall, standing upright. I'm 6'2", and this thing would have towered over me. The way it moved was so fluid, so powerful, like an Olympic athlete but 10 times stronger. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying it in my head. The girls were freaked out too. We sat up late talking about it, trying to convince ourselves it was something explainable. A guy in a suit. Impossible. No human can move that fast through thick brush. A bear? Definitely not. Some other animal. Nothing that exists, at least nothing that's supposed to exist in Michigan. The next morning, I went back alone. It had rained heavily overnight. About 14 hours of steady downpour. Any tracks would have been washed away, and they were. I searched for hours but found nothing. No hair, no footprints, nothing broken except what you'd expect in a forest. Over the next few months, though, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. I found several large 4-toed prints in some soft earth near the creek that runs through my property. They were huge, easily 16 inches long. I tried to take photos, but they didn't really show up well on my phone. Then there were the sounds. Twice that summer, we heard these loud, roaring sounds coming from the woods at night. Not a bear. I know what bears sound like. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like those sounds the dinosaurs make in Jurassic Park, but real. The first time it happened, my dog refused to go outside for 2 days afterward. I started researching, reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in Michigan. There are a lot more than I expected. The Michigan Dogman gets all the press, but there are hundreds of Bigfoot reports from the northern part of the state going back decades. I eventually contacted a local researcher who's been documenting sightings in the area. He came out to my property, and we found some really strange tree structures that I'd never noticed before. Trees bent into teepee formations, small trees twisted together in ways that couldn't be natural. The weirdest was finding full-sized trees turned upside down, with their root balls in the air, wedged between other trees. The researcher said these are classic Bigfoot territorial markers. There are two guys who live about a mile from my cabin in this really remote spot. They live off the grid, no electricity, haul their water from a spring. I got to talking with them at the general store in town, and one of them mentioned hearing roaring calls and Tarzan monkey sounds behind their place. He'd seen something massive moving through the trees at dusk several times, but was too scared to investigate. When I told him what we'd seen, he just nodded like he wasn't surprised at all. I've become obsessed with documenting everything. I've got a file of photos, mostly of the weird tree structures, but also some of the prints I've found in snow and sand. 4 toes, not 5 like a human. Much bigger than any bear print. The girls have both gone off to college now, but whenever they come home and we go up to the cabin, they refuse to hike in certain parts of the woods. Amanda won't go near the spot where we saw it, not even in the truck. Jessica pretends she's not scared, but I've noticed she never goes out alone anymore. The thing that sticks with me the most is the wolf. Predators don't chase things they can't catch or kill. But this wolf was chasing the creature. Why? Was it trying to drive it out of its territory? Was it hunting with it? The relationship between them bothers me almost as much as the creature itself. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story 6 years ago, I'd have thought they were crazy or lying. I was one of those people who rolled their eyes at Bigfoot stories. Not anymore. I know what I saw. My daughters know what they saw. The forest feels different to me now. I still love it up there, still go hunting and fishing. But I'm aware now that I'm not at the top of the food chain. Not even close. There's something in those woods that's watching us, something intelligent enough to stay hidden, something that's probably been there for centuries while we convinced ourselves it was just a myth. I don't try to convince skeptics anymore, but sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch at the cabin at dusk, watching the shadows grow longer between the trees, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving just at the edge of the clearing. Something too big, too fast to be anything known. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 5. I don't talk about this much. Most people just think you're crazy when you bring up something like this, or they laugh it off. But what happened to me back in 1967 in Sorgo still haunts me to this day. I was only 11 years old then, and some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those eyes on me. It was summer in Davies County, Kentucky. We lived in this old farmhouse just outside Sorgo, surrounded by fields and woods. Not much to do for a kid like me, except follow my older brother Nathan around. That particular night started like any other stupid adventure we'd get into. Nathan and his buddy Travis had this brilliant idea to sneak out after our parents went to bed. Nathan was 15 and Travis was 16, so they always thought they were so cool compared to me. But I wasn't about to be left behind. They reluctantly let me tag along, probably because I threatened to wake up our parents if they didn't. Our plan was to drive Nathan's truck, well, not really his, but our dad's old 1960 Ford Falcon pickup that Nathan had claimed as his, down to the creek about a mile from our house. They wanted to smoke cigarettes and drink some beers Travis had stolen from his dad. We waited until nearly 1 a.m. when we were sure our parents were asleep. The house was dead silent except for Dad's snoring echoing down the hallway. We climbed out through Nathan's bedroom window and made our way to where the truck was parked behind the barn. I remember it was unusually foggy that night, with this full moon that made everything look eerie, like the fog was glowing. It was the kind of night that already had me on edge before anything even happened. We got about halfway to the creek when Nathan suddenly realized he'd forgotten the cigarettes. Him and Travis decided they needed to go back to the house to get them, plus some snacks. They were going to sneak up to our sister Lisa's window, her room was closer to the front of the house, and have her pass the stuff out to them. "Stay in the truck, Ethan," Nathan told me. "We'll be back in 10 minutes. Don't touch anything." So there I was, sitting alone in this beat-up old pickup truck at 1 a.m., parked on this narrow gravel lane that cut through the fields on our property. I wasn't supposed to touch anything, but of course I immediately started playing with the radio dials and pretending to drive. The truck wasn't running, Nathan had taken the keys with him, but that didn't stop me from having my fun. I must have been alone for about 5 minutes when I first noticed something weird. The fog had thickened, but there was this gap in it, like something was moving through it, pushing it aside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized there was no wind that night. The air was completely still. I squinted, trying to see better down the lane. That's when I saw it, a large shadow moving toward the truck. My first thought was that it was Nathan and Travis coming back, but this shape was all wrong. It was much taller, and it was just one figure, not two. As it got closer, I started to make out more details, and my stomach dropped. Whatever was walking toward me was massive, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it wasn't walking like a normal person either. It had this strange, lumbering gait, swinging its arms in an exaggerated way. Then the smell hit me. Even with the windows rolled up, this horrible stench seeped into the truck. It was like roadkill that had been sitting in the summer sun for days, mixed with something else I couldn't place, something musky and wild. The smell alone made my eyes water. I ducked down a little, hoping it wouldn't see me, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly in the moonlight. The thing was easily 7.5 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, at least 3 feet across, and it was covered in hair, dark, matted hair that hung off its body like a shaggy coat. But its hands were bare, and its face. I could see its face now, and it wasn't completely covered in hair like the rest of it. It had a face that was... I don't know how to describe it except to say it was like a person's face, but not quite right. Like a caveman from one of my school textbooks, but real and standing right in front of me. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature stopped about 20 feet from the truck and seemed to be looking right at me. I don't know if it could see me clearly through the windshield, but it definitely knew something was there. That's when panic took over. I lunged forward and slammed my palm against the horn. The sound blared out into the quiet night, and the creature's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It grabbed at its ears with those massive hands and let out this scream, not like an animal roar, but a high-pitched screech that sounded almost human, but wrong. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. The thing dropped to a crouch and swiped at the gravel with one of its huge hands, sending rocks flying. Then, before I could react, it bounded forward and leaped into the back of the pickup truck. The entire truck shook violently. I could hear its weight shifting in the bed, the metal groaning. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I frantically hit the horn again and again. Then this massive hairy arm swung around and slapped across the windshield. Its palm was hairless, almost like a human palm but huge, with these long fingers tipped with thick black fingernails or claws. The hand was so big it covered most of the windshield. I scrambled as far away as I could, pressing myself against the passenger door. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. Then came the moment that's burned into my memory forever. The creature brought its face right up to the driver's side window. We were face to face, separated by just a pane of glass, maybe 16 or 18 inches between us. Its eyes, God, its eyes. They were dark and deep-set, but undeniably intelligent. It wasn't looking at me with aggression or hunger. It looked curious. Its upper lip kept twitching, moving up and down like it was trying to smell me better. Then it opened its mouth. I could see everything. Its gums, its tongue, even saliva dripping from its mouth. Its teeth weren't what I expected. It had canine teeth that were bigger than a person's, but they weren't like fangs. They looked more human than animal. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there looking into this thing's eyes while it looked back at me. There was something in that gaze, something that made it even more terrifying than if it had just been a mindless animal. This thing was thinking. It was considering me. In desperation, I slammed the horn again. The loud blare seemed to startle it, and in one fluid motion it leaped off the truck. I swear the truck bounced a foot off the ground when its weight left the bed, and then it was gone, vanished into the fog and darkness so quickly I almost questioned if it had been there at all. But the smell lingered, and the truck was still rocking slightly from the impact of its departure. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking and crying, before I heard Nathan and Travis running back down the lane, shouting my name. They'd heard the horn all the way back at the house. When they reached the truck, they found me huddled on the floor, hyperventilating. I was shaking so bad my teeth were chattering, even though it was a warm summer night. "What happened? What's wrong?" Nathan kept asking, but I couldn't form words at first. Eventually I managed to tell them what I'd seen. Of course, they didn't believe me. Travis thought I was making it up for attention, and Nathan was mad that I'd been honking the horn and might have woken our parents. They thought I'd just scared myself sitting alone in the dark. "It was probably just Old Man Jenkins walking home drunk again," Travis said, laughing. But Old Man Jenkins was maybe 5'8" and skinny as a rail. He didn't have massive hands with black nails. He didn't have a face that looked almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't explain. We drove home in silence, me still trembling, them annoyed at what they thought was my overactive imagination. When we got back, they made me promise not to tell our parents about sneaking out. I agreed, but not because I was worried about getting in trouble. Who would believe me anyway? The thing is, that wasn't the end of it. Over the next 2 years, strange things kept happening around our property. We'd find huge, unexplainable footprints in the mud near the creek. The dogs would go crazy barking at nothing in the middle of the night. Livestock would get spooked for no reason. And I wasn't the only one who saw something. About 3 months after my encounter, my sister Lisa saw what she described as a giant, hairy man watching her from the edge of the woods while she was hanging laundry. She ran inside screaming, and Dad went out with his shotgun, but found nothing. A few months after that, Nathan finally admitted to me that he'd seen something too, while hunting in the back 40. He'd been up in a deer stand at dawn when he spotted a large, hair-covered figure moving through the trees. He said he watched it through his rifle scope, but was too shocked to shoot. When he told Dad, claiming it was a bear, Dad reminded him there hadn't been bears in our part of Kentucky for decades. We started hearing stories from neighbors, too. The Wilsons down the road lost 3 of their chickens in one night, with nothing left but scattered feathers and strangely twisted necks. The Peterson boy claimed something huge had followed him home from fishing one evening. In town, we heard people had been calling the local paper in Owensboro about sightings of a wild man in the woods. There was even a small article about it, speculating it might be a drifter living off the land. We kids called it the Hermit, not knowing what else to call it. This was before Bigfoot and Sasquatch became household names in the 70s. Whatever was out there, it seemed to disappear by late 1968. The sightings stopped, the strange occurrences died down, and life went back to normal. But I never forgot. For years afterward, I couldn't sleep with my window open, even on the hottest summer nights. I refused to go out to the barn alone after dark. And to this day, I can't stand the smell of anything rotting or decaying. It immediately brings me back to that night. I've had people tell me it was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs. Others suggest it was some homeless person with a deformity or mental illness. A few even suggested I dreamed the whole thing, or that my memory has distorted what was actually just a frightening but ordinary encounter. But I know what I saw. I know how close it was to me, how clearly I could see its face, the intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved, the impossible strength it displayed, the way it vanished into the night. I'm 67 years old now, and I've never seen anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm driving on a foggy night, I find myself checking the rearview mirror a little more often, and I always keep my windows rolled up. Story 6. I've debated posting this for a long time. 12 years, to be exact. Most people I've told either think I'm crazy or lying. My wife believes me, but even she gets uncomfortable when I bring it up now. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened on November 17th, 2011. I remember the exact date because it was my dad's birthday, and I'd promised to bring home venison for the family celebration that weekend. I'm an avid hunter and have been since I was a kid. I live in Anderson County, Kentucky, on about 80 acres that's been in my family for generations. Beautiful countryside, lots of woods and open fields, and usually teeming with deer. I'd set up my deer stand about 2 weeks earlier in this huge oak that gives me a perfect view of an open field where the deer often graze in the evening. That Thursday, I got off work early and was in my stand by 4:30 p.m. It was one of those perfect November evenings, crisp air around 45 degrees, barely any wind. The sun was starting to go down, and I was settling in for what I hoped would be a productive hunt. By 5 p.m., the light was starting to fade. Not dark yet, but that golden hour when everything gets this weird clarity. I hadn't seen any deer, which was starting to get frustrating. I'd been noticing fewer and fewer on my property that year, which was strange because I'd always kept it as a sort of sanctuary for them. No hunting except by me and close family, good water sources, plenty of food. But that entire fall had been unusually quiet. I was actually checking my phone when I heard something moving in the tree line about 150 yards to my right. I immediately put my phone away and grabbed my binoculars, expecting to finally see a deer. What came out of those trees wasn't a deer, not even close. 2 figures emerged from the woods and started moving across the open field. At first glance, I thought they were people, maybe trespassers or hunters who'd wandered onto my property, but something was immediately off. They were running, not exactly running, but like fast jogging. And they moved weird, really weird. Through my binoculars, I could see them clearly. There were 2 of them, bipedal, covered in hair. One was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with black hair all over its body. The other was smaller, maybe 6 feet, with this lighter blonde or tan hair that reminded me of a coyote. They weren't wearing clothes. They weren't humans in costumes. I know what ghillie suits look like, and this wasn't that. Their arms were the first thing that made my stomach drop. They hung way past their knees. No human has arms like that, and their chests were like barrels, massive and round. The hair covering them wasn't long and flowing like you see in the movies. It was shorter, maybe 5 inches at most, and matted in places like it had been rained on, or they'd been sweating. The way they moved was something I still can't fully explain. They didn't bounce up and down like humans do when jogging. It was smoother, almost like they were gliding across the field, even though their legs were definitely moving. They were booking it too, crossed that 100-yard field in about 10 seconds. What really freaked me out was that 3 separate times while crossing, they both twisted their upper bodies from the waist to look behind them, like they were checking if something was following them. They didn't slow down at all when they did this. Their heads just swiveled back while their legs kept moving forward at the same pace. Humans can't move like that, at least not smoothly like they were doing. They were about 35 yards from my tree stand at the closest point. Close enough that I could make out details I wish I couldn't. Their bodies were stocky, like football players, but more powerful looking. They barely had necks. Their heads just kind of sat on their shoulders. And their heads were shaped weird, slightly pointed at the top, with eyes that seemed deeply set in their faces. The big one's face was darker than its hair, almost like it was dirty or tanned. The smaller one's face matched its hair color more. I could see their feet clearly at one point. They looked almost human-like, but bigger, tan-colored and dirty, like they'd been walking barefoot forever. Their upper bodies had tons of hair, but their legs, while still hairy, weren't as covered. I could see the muscles moving under the hair as they ran. I didn't move a muscle the whole time. I was frozen in my stand, binoculars pressed so hard against my face they left marks. I wasn't breathing. I was terrified they'd look up and see me, but they seemed completely focused on getting across that field and back into the woods on the other side. They never slowed down, never vocalized, just moved with this weird purpose. When they disappeared into the trees on the far side of the field, I still didn't move. My hands were shaking so bad I had to put the binoculars down before I dropped them. I kept staring at the spot where they'd entered the woods, half expecting them to come back out. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Bears walking on hind legs. No way. People in suits. The proportions were all wrong. The arms alone would be impossible to fake that convincingly. I sat there for probably 15 minutes, just trying to get my shit together. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there immediately, but another part was worried they might still be nearby. I finally decided I needed better equipment if I was going to investigate. I climbed down from my stand as quietly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. The walk back to my truck was the longest quarter-mile of my life. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept feeling like something was watching me from the trees. When I got home, my wife asked why I was back so early. I must have looked as shaken as I felt, because her expression changed immediately when she saw my face. I told her I needed my better flashlight and my handgun. She started asking questions, but I just said I'd seen something strange and wanted to check it out. I didn't tell her exactly what, not then. I grabbed my Glock and my brightest tactical flashlight and headed back out. By then it was fully dark, around 6:15 p.m. I parked in the same spot and walked back to where my stand was. I stood at the edge of the field for a long time, shining my light into the darkness, listening for any unusual sounds. Eventually, I worked up the courage to cross the field to where they had entered the woods. I searched the ground for tracks or any sign they'd been there. The grass was tall in spots, and I couldn't find anything definitive. I shined my light into the tree line, but couldn't bring myself to actually go into the woods. It was pitch black in there, and the thought of running into those things in the dark was too much. I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared shitless. After about 20 minutes of half-hearted searching, I gave up and went home. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over. I told my wife everything, and to her credit, she didn't laugh or call me crazy. She just listened, looking more concerned as I described the details. The next day, I went back in the daylight and spent hours looking for tracks or hair or anything. I found some areas where the grass was matted down, but nothing conclusive. No footprints in the softer ground near the woods, no hair caught on branches that I could find. If I hadn't seen them with my own eyes, there'd be no evidence they were ever there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more things that seemed off. I realized I hadn't seen a single deer on my property that whole fall, despite it being peak season. My apple trees, which usually drop tons of fruit that sits on the ground until it rots, were completely bare underneath. The apples were disappearing before they hit the ground. I started carrying my gun everywhere on my property. I'd find myself staring out the windows at night, especially toward those woods. I stopped hunting alone that season. My enthusiasm for being out in my tree stand at dusk completely vanished. About a month after the sighting, something clicked in my brain. Back in 2006, my daughter, who was 4 at the time, had come running into the house one afternoon, all excited, saying she'd seen 2 big monkeys in our backyard. One of them, she said, was waving at her. My wife and I had laughed it off. We figured she'd been watching too many cartoons or had seen our neighbor's Great Danes running around. She kept asking about those monkeys for years afterwards, always so adamant about what she'd seen. After my experience in the field, her story took on a whole new meaning. We live in Kentucky, for God's sake. We don't have monkeys. What my little girl saw, what she tried to tell us about all those years, was the same thing I saw running across my field. I'm sure of it now. I've spent countless hours researching since then. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them. Some of the descriptions match what I saw perfectly. The height, the proportions, the way they moved. I've read about them traveling in family groups. Was the smaller one a juvenile? Were they parent and child? I don't know. What I do know is that they seem to be running from something, and that's what bothers me the most. What makes creatures that size, that powerful-looking, run like that? What were they afraid of? I still live on the same property. I still hunt, though never in that specific area. I've never seen them again, but I feel their presence sometimes. The property feels different now, like I'm not always alone out there. The deer population has never really recovered on my land. I don't talk about this much anymore. People either think you're crazy or they turn it into some kind of joke. But I know what I saw. Those weren't people in suits, they weren't bears. They were something else, something that isn't supposed to exist in the hills of Kentucky. But they do. My daughter saw them. I saw them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is fading, just like it was that November day, I find myself staring out at that field, wondering if they're still out there, wondering what they were running from, and wondering if someday it might find its way to my door. Story 7. I've been debating whether to post this for months, maybe years. It happened last summer, but sometimes I still wake up screaming, thinking I can feel my right arm again. The doctors call it phantom limb syndrome. I know better. I know what took it. I was visiting family in Medford, Oregon last summer. I'm from a small town in Utah, and I've always been into long-distance running. It clears my head. And man, did I need that clarity then. My girlfriend and I had just broken up. My job was a dead end, and I felt like I was suffocating in my hometown. Running was my escape. The morning it happened was scorching hot, even at 6 a.m. I told my aunt I was going for a run, maybe a couple hours. Nothing unusual for me. I'd mapped out a route starting from Summit Avenue. The plan was to follow Taylor Road out of town, then hit Old Stage Road. Nothing too crazy. I remember feeling good that morning. Like, really good. The kind of runner's high where your legs just want to keep going. So when I reached the turnoff where I was supposed to head back, I didn't. There was this small lane starting with P something, Peachblow or Peachtree, I can't remember now. It headed upward into the hills, and I thought, why not? I had water in my camelback, some energy bars in my fanny pack. I was prepared for a longer run than planned. As the sun climbed higher, so did I. The road kept winding up, and the houses got more spread out until they disappeared altogether. By noon, I'd reached a ridge that gave me an incredible view of the valley. I stopped for a snack, sitting on a boulder at the edge of a clearing. The forest around me smelled incredible, pine and earth and something sweet I couldn't place. It was intoxicating. I should have turned back then. But I had this weird urge to find the best viewpoint, like I needed to see everything from the highest point possible. So I left the trail and pushed through some thick forest, heading toward what I thought was the summit. After about 30 minutes of bushwhacking, I realized I'd been wrong. What I thought was the summit was just another ridge, and beyond it I could see a dirt road in the distance. My legs were getting tired, but I figured if I could reach that road, it would lead me back down to civilization. So I kept going. When I finally reached the dirt road, I was exhausted, but relieved. The view was spectacular. I could see the Rogue River snaking through the valley and what looked like some strip mining operations in the distance. I figured I'd take the road down, find a main highway, and maybe hitch a ride back to town. But the road didn't go down. It continued along the ridgeline, sometimes dipping slightly before rising again. I kept thinking the next bend would start the descent, but it never did. Hours passed. My food was gone, and my water was almost depleted. The sun was starting to lower in the sky when I finally admitted I was lost. I tried using my phone, but there was no signal up there. Panic started to set in. I decided to try retracing my steps, hoping to find the clearing where I'd stopped for lunch. I was hurrying, not watching my footing like I should have. That's when I fell. There was a short cliff, maybe 10 feet high, that I didn't see until I was already tumbling over it. I hit my head on something hard, a rock or a log, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the sun was setting, painting the forest in deep oranges and reds. My head was throbbing, and I could feel blood trickling down my face. But that wasn't what got my attention first. It was the smell. God, that smell. Like rotten milk and decay mixed with something musky and animal. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Or maybe that was the blood. I wiped my eyes, and that's when I saw it. I still don't know what to call it. A creature, I guess. It was wrapped around a large tree about 25 feet away from me, just watching. The setting sun illuminated it perfectly, and I could see its fur was a brilliant, unnatural red, not like a fox or anything I've ever seen. It was the color of fresh blood. The fur covered its whole body except for its face. It had fur on its head, its fingers, the tops of its feet, but its face was hairless, a dark grey color that looked almost blue in the fading light. Its eyes were brown, but so dilated they looked black, and they were fixed on me with an intelligence that froze my blood. It had a nose, nostrils that flared as it breathed in my scent. Its mouth was broad, with an even broader lower jaw that jutted out slightly, and its hands. God! Its hands were the most terrifying part. They were huge and so human-like it made me sick. It had dark grey fingernails, thick and sturdy-looking. I didn't move. I couldn't. We just stared at each other as the light continued to fade. It was completely still, except for those eyes that tracked every tiny movement I made. I knew somehow that if I ran, it would chase me, and it would catch me. So I started to inch backward, up the small slope toward the road. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure it could hear it. My head injury made everything swimmy, and I kept having to blink blood out of my eyes. The creature didn't move from its tree, just watched. I got about 10 feet away when I tripped over a fallen log and fell flat on my back. That's when it moved. It didn't run or walk. It leapt. Fucking leapt through the air like it was nothing and landed directly over me, its feet straddling my body. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and it blotted out what little light was left in the sky. I couldn't even scream. My throat closed up from pure terror. I just laid there, pissing myself while this thing towered over me. It reached down and tore apart my fanny pack, just ripped it to shreds with those massive hands. Then it did the same to my camelback. It seemed to be searching for food. Finding nothing, it leaned down and started smelling me. Its face was inches from mine, and that stench was unbearable. Its breath was hot and reeked of rotten meat. Then it moved down to my right arm. I had a small scrape there from the fall, and it was bleeding slightly. The creature's nostrils flared wider, and I saw its mouth open slightly. What happened next is something I relive every night in my nightmares. It bit down on my right forearm with a force that defies description. There wasn't even pain at first, just an immense pressure and a sound like celery being snapped, but 1,000 times louder. It bit my arm off, clean, one bite. I remember looking at the stump in shock while my brain tried to process what had happened. The creature jumped back, my severed arm hanging from its mouth. Then it leapt to another tree 20 feet away like gravity didn't apply to it. The last I saw, it was disappearing into the forest, my arm in its mouth, like a dog with a bone. The pain hit then, a white-hot agony that made me scream until my voice gave out. Blood was pumping from the stump in rhythmic spurts. I knew I was going to die if I didn't stop the bleeding. I don't know where I found the strength. Shock, maybe. Adrenaline. I tore off my t-shirt and managed to wrap it around the stump, pulling it tight with my teeth and my remaining hand. The pain was unimaginable, but somehow I got up. I stumbled through the woods, following what I hoped was the direction of the road. Blood loss made me dizzy, and I fell repeatedly. Each time I expected to feel those hands grabbing me, pulling me back into the forest. By some miracle, I reached the road as full darkness fell. I collapsed there, hoping someone would find me before I bled out or before that thing came back to finish me off. I don't know how long I laid there. Hours, maybe. I drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, headlights appeared, and a U.S. Forest Service Jeep pulled up. The guy inside later told me he almost ran me over. He was just doing a routine check of the fire roads before heading home for the night. He radioed for a helicopter while trying to keep me alive. I remember him talking, trying to keep me conscious. He kept asking what happened, and when I finally managed to tell him about the creature, he got really quiet. Then he said something that still haunts me. He said, "They're losing their habitat and food sources. The logging and the mining are pushing them closer to our settlements. He said they. At the hospital, the doctors said it was a cougar attack. But I know what I saw, and cougars don't bite off limbs in one clean bite. They tear and maul. There were no claw marks on me, just the clean amputation of my arm. The official report says animal attack, species unknown. My family thinks it was a bear or a cougar. No one believes me when I try to tell them what really happened. They think the head injury and blood loss made me hallucinate. But I know what I saw. I know what took my arm. And sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed and the phantom pain starts up, I swear I can feel those eyes watching me again, like it's waiting. I haven't been back to Oregon since. I don't run in the woods anymore. I don't even like being outside after sunset because I know they're out there and they're hungry. I live in the city now, as far from forests and mountains as I can get. I tell people I lost my arm in a car accident. It's easier that way. No one believes the truth anyway, but I know, and now so do you. I still haven't decided if I'm going to submit this post. Maybe I'll just delete it. Maybe talking about it will make it come for me again. But I had to get this out somewhere. I had to tell someone who might believe me. If you're planning a trip to southern Oregon, stay on the marked trails. Don't go running alone. And if you smell something like rotten milk and decay, run. Run as fast as you can in the opposite direction, before it's too late. Story 8. I've been trying to make sense of what happened to me for almost 45 years now. I've told this story a handful of times, mostly to people I trust completely, and I always get the same reactions. Either they think I'm making it up, or they get that look of pity reserved for the mentally unwell. So I stopped sharing it, but lately I've been having dreams about that night again, and I need to get this off my chest. It was December 1978, just a few days before Christmas. I was 32 then, living alone in a small rental near Florence, Oregon. My husband and I had separated that summer, and I'd moved from our home in Anchorage with my German Shepherd Ranger. He was my rock during that difficult period. The most loyal, brave dog you could imagine. We'd been through a lot together in Alaska, including encounters with moose and even a black bear once. Nothing ever fazed him. I couldn't sleep that night. December 21st, I think it was. Around 1 a.m., I decided to take Ranger for our walk, something I often did when insomnia hit. We drove out to one of our usual spots near Higgins Lake, just west of Highway 101, across from Honeyman State Park. The Oregon Dunes area was beautiful and peaceful at night. The weather was typical coastal winter, hazy but with enough moonlight to see by, mild for December but with a brisk wind coming in from the west. I parked my Ford Pinto at a little turnout, and Ranger and I started our usual route. We headed up into the dunes and ridges covered with beach grass and scattered thickets. I had my walking stick with me, not for protection exactly, just something I always carried on our walks. The area was all rolling terrain with these ridge-like dunes that ran roughly north-south. After about 15 minutes, I climbed up to a high point on one of these ridges to take in the view. The moonlight was filtering through the haze, casting this strange silvery light over everything. That's when I first noticed it, a silhouette moving along a parallel ridge about 400 yards away. I initially thought it was another night walker, or maybe a park ranger, though that would have been unusual that time of night. Something about the way it moved made me uneasy, though. It was coming in our direction, and I decided I didn't want to be seen. I quickly moved down off the ridge into a hollow area where it was darker, pulling Ranger close to me. We crouched down in some beach grass, and I watched as this figure continued to approach along the ridge. As it got closer, I could tell it was moving at a steady, quick pace. That's when Ranger's behavior changed completely. His ears went up, and he started growling low in his throat. Before I could grab his collar, he bolted away from me, running toward the figure and barking aggressively, his protective instinct kicking in. I whisper-shouted for him to come back, terrified he'd get hurt if this was some dangerous person. What happened next still makes my skin crawl. Ranger reached about 150 feet from the figure, then suddenly stopped barking. Instead, he let out these weird, high-pitched whines I'd never heard from him before. Then he turned and ran back to me, pressing against my legs and shivering uncontrollably. This was a dog that had confronted bears without backing down. Now he was trembling like a puppy in a thunderstorm. I remember putting my hand on his head and feeling how his fur was standing straight up. The figure didn't stop or change direction, it just kept coming toward us. That's when I first noticed its strange walk. The head and shoulders moved forward without the usual up and down motion humans have when walking. It reminded me of someone on cross-country skis, gliding rather than stepping. I could see the legs swinging sideways with each step, causing a sliding motion of the feet. It stopped exactly where Ranger had turned back, about 150 feet from our position. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. Ranger was still shaking against me. For several minutes, this thing just stood there, completely still. I remember thinking that no human could stand that motionless for that long. Then it hunched down, almost like it was crouching to look at something on the ground. After a moment, it stood back up to its full height. I don't know why this detail has stuck with me so clearly, but I watched it cup its hands on either side of its head, like someone trying to hear better against the wind. That simple, human-like gesture somehow made the whole thing even more terrifying. It started moving again, this time more slowly and deliberately. The way it walked now was different, a dramatic side-to-side swaying motion that no human would use. As it got closer, the moonlight gave me a better silhouette view, and I realized with absolute shock that this thing was naked. I could clearly see its A-lined legs in outline against the night sky. One detail that registered even in my state of terror was how it placed each foot. Every step landed precisely in line with the previous one, creating a single straight track rather than the parallel tracks humans leave. The next day I confirmed this when I went back to look at the footprints. I'm not good at estimating heights, but this thing was huge. I'd guess between 8 and 9 feet tall. The head was massive and sat directly on enormous shoulders with no visible neck. There was a strange peak on top of its head and what looked like a backpack or hump on its shoulders. Its arms hung incredibly long, with hands that seemed to reach almost to its knees. Despite its bulk up top, it had a surprisingly narrow waist. Occasionally, the wind would catch the hair on its head, making it flare up momentarily. I was struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't human. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. Yet it moved with clear purpose and intelligence. Suddenly, without warning, it dropped into a low position and then launched itself sideways off the ridge. What I saw next defies explanation. This thing ran with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. It covered about 95 feet in just 3 strides, each leap spanning roughly 30 feet. Its running style was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Legs straight out front and back, suggesting a completely different hip structure than humans have. Those 3 massive strides took it down into a thicket where I lost sight of it. The whole movement was so explosive and powerful that I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew with absolute certainty that if this thing wanted to catch me, I wouldn't stand a chance. I sat frozen in that hollow for what felt like forever, expecting it to burst out of the darkness at any moment. Ranger was still trembling against me, occasionally making small whimpering sounds. I had to make a decision. Stay hidden and hope it didn't find us or try to make it back to my car. Finally, I decided I couldn't just sit there all night. In a moment of either bravery or complete stupidity, I stood up on the ridge, making myself visible. I waved my walking stick and even called out a weak "hello," as if this thing was just some neighbor I'd run into. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking, but some part of me thought that hiding might trigger a predatory response, while showing myself might make me seem less like prey. Then I forced myself to walk, not run, back toward my car. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to sprint, but I maintained a steady pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. Ranger stayed pressed against my leg the whole way, something he never did on walks. The half-mile back to the car felt like crossing the entire state of Oregon. When we finally reached the Pinto, I practically threw Ranger in and jumped behind the wheel. Out of habit, I didn't immediately close the windows. It was something about living in Alaska and letting the dog hang his head out that just became routine. That's when I heard it. From somewhere back in the direction we'd come from, there came a scream. Not an animal noise, not quite human either. It was loud enough that I felt it more than heard it, a deep, resonating sound that paralyzed me completely. A few seconds later, there was a second scream, even louder than the first. I can't describe the effect it had on me, except to say I couldn't move, couldn't think. Ranger started howling in response, a mournful sound I'd never heard him make before. I rolled up the windows with shaking hands, started the car, and got us out of there as fast as that old Pinto could manage. I didn't even turn on the headlights until I was back on the highway. I barely slept that night. As soon as it was light the next morning, I went back. I know that sounds crazy, but I had to know if there was any evidence of what I'd seen, or if I'd somehow hallucinated the whole thing. The area looked different in daylight, less menacing, more familiar. I found the ridge where the creature had walked. There were footprints, or half footprints really, as they were on the side of the ridge. They were enormous, about 8 to 9 inches wide, which would mean they were probably 18 to 20 inches long, based on normal foot proportions. The stride length between them was over 5 feet, 4 inches. And just as I'd observed the night before, they formed a single straight line, rather than the parallel tracks humans leave. What struck me most was how the prints showed weight, mostly on the front part of the foot, as if this thing had been deliberately walking in a way to minimize noise, a stealth approach. It had known I was there long before I spotted it. I also found where it had launched itself off the ridge, a deep depression in the sand and grass where it had pushed off with tremendous force. And I could see the 3 huge impressions where it had landed during those massive strides. I never went back to that spot again. I moved away from the area a few months later, back to the Midwest where I grew up. Ranger was never quite the same after that night. He became anxious on walks and would refuse to go out after dark. He died 3 years later, and I've never owned another dog. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw. Was it a man in some kind of costume or on stilts? Impossible given the movements and speed I witnessed. Was it a bear or other known animal? Nothing matches the description or behavior. The logical part of my brain keeps trying to find an explanation that fits into our normal understanding of the world, but I can't find one. I've read about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings over the years. Some of the descriptions match what I saw that night, but reading about something and coming face to face with it are very different things. I don't know what to believe anymore, except that what I experienced was real, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world. I'm 76 now, and I've never told this story publicly before. I don't expect people to believe me, but I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt that night. Whatever it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it knew I was there. Why it didn't harm me, I'll never know. Maybe it was just as curious about me as I was terrified of it. All I know is that I can't explain what happened, and I never will be able to. Story 9. I've never told anyone outside of my scout group about this, and even now, 23 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I was 14 when it happened, July 2001, during what was supposed to be just another summer camping trip with my Boy Scout troop in Wyoming. We were deep in the Wind River Range, part of Bridger-Teton National Forest. It was my 3rd summer with the troop, and I was excited because we were going to a really remote spot, Junction Lake. This wasn't one of those drive-up campgrounds with bathrooms and picnic tables. We had to hike about 10 miles with our packs to get there, which made it feel like a real adventure. There were 8 of us scouts plus Mr. Peterson, our troop leader. He was this really serious guy who worked as a wildlife biologist for the state. He knew everything about animals and was always pointing out tracks and scat and telling us what had made them. Looking back, I think that's why nobody believed us at first, because if Mr. Peterson said it was just a bear, who were we to argue? We'd set up our camp about a quarter mile from the lake, in this little clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines. The first 2 days were normal: fishing, hiking, learning wilderness skills. Nothing weird at all. Then came the 3rd day. Me and Jake, not his real name, decided to explore around the lake before dinner. We'd been fishing most of the afternoon but hadn't caught much, so we thought we'd check out the north side of the lake where nobody had gone yet. Mr. Peterson said it was fine as long as we were back before dark and stayed together. The sun was getting low, probably around 7:30 or 8, but in July it stays light pretty late up there. We'd made our way around most of the shoreline, and we're at the north end where there's this rocky slope that goes up maybe 100 feet above the water. We thought it would be cool to climb up and see the view. About halfway up, we heard this weird sound. At first I thought it was a bear, like a low growl that kind of rumbled. We froze and looked at each other. We'd been taught what to do if we encountered a bear, but we didn't actually see anything, and the sound seemed pretty far away. "Should we go back?" Jake whispered. I shook my head. Mr. Peterson said the noise would scare them off, and it sounds far away. So we kept climbing, being extra careful to make noise like we'd been taught, talking loudly, occasionally clapping, basic stuff to make sure we didn't surprise any wildlife. We reached the top and hung out there for maybe 10 minutes, looking at the view of the lake below us. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the mountains perfectly. It was getting darker though, so we decided to head back down. The descent was trickier than going up. The slope was covered in loose rocks and scree, and we had to be careful not to slip. We were about halfway down when I heard something behind us, up where we'd just been. It was like a rock being kicked or something scraping against stone. I turned around, scanning the area we'd just left. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the trees and rocks. Then something moved. About 15 feet away, this thing stepped out from behind a tree. I'll never forget the way my stomach dropped. It was like all the air got sucked out of me at once. It was standing on two legs, about my height or a little shorter. I was 5'5" then, covered in light brown fur. The first thing I noticed was its face. Around its eyes was this dark area, almost like it was wearing a mask, but it was just darker fur. Its eyes themselves were these black dots that didn't look right, not like an animal's eyes, and definitely not like a human's. And it had this beard-like hair covering its neck. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple seconds. Then it made this sound, not a growl exactly, more like a low huffing noise. Then it just turned and walked away. Not on all fours like a bear would, if it stood up and then dropped down. This thing walked away on 2 feet, swinging its arms like a person would. Jake grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Run," he whispered. And we did. We practically flew down that slope, slipping and sliding on loose rocks, not even caring if we got hurt. All I could think was that I needed to get away from whatever that thing was. We ran all the way back to camp, which took maybe 15 minutes at a dead sprint. We burst into the clearing where everyone was setting up for dinner, completely out of breath and probably looking terrified. "What's wrong? What happened?" Mr. Peterson demanded, immediately going into emergency mode. We were both talking at once, words tumbling out about what we'd seen. I remember the exact moment when Mr. Peterson's face changed from concern to skepticism. "Sounds like you boys saw a black bear that stood up to check you out," he said, his voice calm but with this edge that made it clear he thought we were exaggerating. "No," Jake insisted. "It wasn't a bear. It walked away on 2 legs. It had a face." "Bears can stand and even take a few steps on their hind legs," Mr. Peterson explained, like we were in science class. "And in the dusk, with your adrenaline pumping, it's easy to misinterpret what you're seeing." But we knew what we saw. I tried to explain the details, the way it moved, the dark area around its eyes, how it swung its arms when it walked away. The more I described it, the more uncomfortable Mr. Peterson looked. "Did anyone else see a bear today?" he asked the group, completely ignoring what we were actually saying. Nobody had. Later that night, when everyone was sitting around the campfire, Mr. Peterson pulled us aside. His tone was different now, less dismissive, more, I don't know, concerned maybe. "Tell me again exactly what you saw," he said quietly. "And I need you to really think about it. Was it possibly a bear, or maybe someone from another camping group playing a joke?" We went through it all again. The height, about 5'3", the light brown fur, the dark area around the eyes, the beard-like neck, the way it walked like a human, but definitely wasn't one. I told him about the eyes, how they were just these black dots that didn't look right. "And there's no way someone could have hiked all the way out here with a costume," Jake added. "We're miles from anywhere." Mr. Peterson just nodded slowly. "Let's check for tracks tomorrow," he finally said. "If there was something there, it might have left footprints." I barely slept that night. Our tent was on the edge of the clearing, and every little sound from the forest made me jump. I kept thinking about those eyes, those wrong black dot eyes, and the way it had just turned and walked away. Why didn't it run? Why didn't it seem afraid of us? The next morning, Mr. Peterson took us back to the spot. It had rained lightly overnight, one of those quick mountain showers, and the rocky ground didn't show much. We searched for almost an hour but couldn't find any definitive tracks. "The rain probably washed them away," Mr. Peterson said, but I could tell he was relieved we hadn't found anything. It was easier to dismiss without evidence. For the rest of the trip, we weren't allowed to go exploring without an adult. Nobody said it was because of what we'd seen, but we all knew. The other scouts thought it was hilarious. They kept making jokes about Jake and Dan's Bigfoot. They'd make these stupid ape noises whenever we walked by. On our last night, Mr. Peterson sat next to me while I was tending the fire. Everyone else was playing cards or getting ready for bed. "I've worked in wildlife biology for 15 years, he said quietly, poking at the embers with a stick. I've studied black bears, grizzlies, wolverines, pretty much every predator in these mountains. I just nodded, not sure where he was going with this. There are only 3 possibilities for what you boys saw, he continued. 1, you saw some kind of unknown bipedal creature that science hasn't documented. 2, you misidentified a known animal in poor lighting conditions. Or 3, against all logic, someone hiked 10 miles into the wilderness wearing a costume to scare some random scouts they couldn't have known would be there. He looked at me directly then. I don't believe in Sasquatch. I never have. But I also don't think you're lying about what you saw. That was as close as he ever came to saying he believed us. When we got back to civilization, the whole thing kind of faded away. Life went on. School started. I got my first girlfriend, normal teenage stuff. Jake and I talked about it sometimes, but less and less as the years passed. We both stayed in Scouts, but we never went back to Junction Lake. I'm 37 now. I've hiked and camped all over the country, and I've never seen anything like that again. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe the failing light played tricks on our eyes. I've read about pareidolia, how the human brain is wired to see faces in random patterns, but then I remember those eyes, and the way it walked away, and I know what I saw wasn't a bear or a trick of the light. It was something else, something that doesn't fit into the neat categories of animals I learned about in biology class. I don't tell this story often because I know how it sounds. I don't have proof. I don't have a blurry photo or a plaster cast of a footprint. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes for those few seconds on a rocky slope in Wyoming when I was 14. I don't know if it was what people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or something else entirely, but I know it was real. And sometimes when I'm hiking alone and hear a noise behind me, I find myself turning quickly, half expecting to see those black dot eyes staring back at me from a not quite human face. I haven't been back to Junction Lake. I'm not sure I ever will. Some places hold memories that are better left undisturbed, but sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching from behind the trees just out of sight. Story 10. I've been carrying this with me for almost 40 years now. It happened during the summer of 1985, and I've never really talked about it with anyone except my wife. Maybe writing it down will help me process what happened, I don't know. All I know is that I still get chills when I think about those days at our family cabin in Voxna. My name is Anders Gustafsson. My wife Ingrid and I were both in our early 30s back then. We had this rustic little cabin south of Bollnäs in Hälsingland that had been in my family for generations. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a living area with a fireplace and a small kitchen. No electricity, just kerosene lamps and a wood stove. We loved it though. It was our escape from our apartment in Stockholm, where I worked as an electrical engineer and Ingrid as a schoolteacher. That summer, we planned to spend 3 weeks there. We arrived on July 15th, a beautiful sunny Monday. The drive up from Stockholm had been pleasant, and we were looking forward to mushroom picking, fishing, and just relaxing by the nearby lake. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, about half a kilometer from the nearest neighbor and 2 kilometers from the main road. We loved the isolation. The first few days were perfect. The weather was unusually warm for Sweden, and we spent our time fixing up the cabin, gathering berries and enjoying the outdoors. On Thursday night, though, something changed. We were sitting on the porch after dinner, drinking coffee and watching the sunset. That's when we heard it for the first time. It started as a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere in the forest to the north. At first, I thought it was a moose. They can make some strange noises. But this was different. It was deeper, almost like a human voice, but impossibly low, like someone with the deepest bass you could imagine. It wasn't quite a moan, not quite a growl, more like a deliberate vocalization. "What was that?" Ingrid whispered, gripping my arm. "Probably just a moose," I said, trying to sound confident. But the hair on my arms was standing up. The sound came again, longer this time, rising and falling in a way that seemed almost communicative. It echoed through the trees, and then, to our horror, we heard what sounded like a response from the east side of our property. A similar call, but with a different tone. "Anders, that's not a moose," Ingrid said. Her fingers were digging into my arm. We went inside and locked the door, feeling foolish but frightened nonetheless. That night we heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I told myself it was just deer or elk, but deep down I knew whatever was making those footsteps was too heavy for the local wildlife. The footfalls had a weight to them that made the ground seem to vibrate. Whatever it was, it circled the cabin several times before moving off into the forest. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. That's when I found the first footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, massive impressions in the soft soil near our garden, easily 45 centimeters long and 30 centimeters wide. They weren't bear prints. I know what those look like. These were clearly foot-shaped, with what looked like 5 toes, similar to a human foot, but much, much larger. The stride length between prints was enormous, nearly 2 meters apart. I didn't tell Ingrid right away. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. Instead, I followed the tracks a short distance into the forest before they disappeared on the rocky ground. About 50 meters in, I found something else disturbing. A pile of excrement that looked unnervingly human-like, but much larger. It was fresh, and the smell was awful, not like animal droppings, but somehow worse, more pungent and almost musky. When I returned to the cabin, Ingrid was fixing breakfast, but I could tell she was on edge. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Nothing to worry about," I lied. "Probably just some elk passing through." We tried to have a normal day, but both of us were listening, constantly on alert. Around midday, we decided to go to the lake about a kilometer away to swim and try to shake off our unease. The forest path to the lake had always been peaceful, but that day it felt ominous. The birds were quiet. The usual chittering of squirrels and small creatures was absent. The whole forest seemed to be holding its breath. At the lake, we tried to relax. It was a beautiful spot, secluded and surrounded by tall pines with a small sandy beach on one side. We swam for a while, and for a brief time, the fear from the previous night receded. Then, as we were drying off on the shore, we heard it. A strange whistling sound from the trees across the lake. It wasn't like any bird call I'd ever heard. It was melodic, almost like someone whistling a tune, but with an eerie, inhuman quality to it. As we listened, frozen in place, another whistle answered from behind us, closer to the path back to our cabin. "We need to go," Ingrid whispered, already gathering our things. We hurried back along the path, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest felt hostile now, the shadows between the trees too dark, the spaces too narrow. About halfway back to the cabin, we heard crashing sounds in the undergrowth to our right, as if something large was moving parallel to us, just out of sight. We broke into a run, heedless of the branches whipping our faces. As we ran, the crashing kept pace with us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but always just out of view. We burst into the clearing around our cabin and rushed inside, locking the door behind us. For the rest of the day, we stayed inside, jumping at every sound. As darkness fell, the whistling started again, coming from different directions around the cabin. It was like they, whatever they were communicating, coordinating. "What are they?" Ingrid asked, her voice small in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think there's more than one." That night was the worst. Around midnight, the howling started again, that same impossibly deep, bass-heavy sound that seemed almost human, yet not human at all. It was closer now, just at the edge of the clearing. I peered out the window, but could see nothing in the darkness. Then, silhouetted against the night sky, I saw it. A massive figure standing upright at the edge of the trees. It was huge, easily over 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered and powerful-looking. Even in silhouette, I could tell it wasn't human. The proportions were wrong. Arms too long, head set directly on powerful shoulders with almost no neck. As I watched, it raised its head and made that terrible howling sound again. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. "There's something out there," I whispered to Ingrid. "Something big." She came to the window and we watched together as the figure moved along the tree line, joined by what appeared to be a second, slightly smaller creature. They seemed to be studying our cabin, moving with a strange mix of caution and confidence. The way they moved was both primitive and intelligent. There was purpose in their actions, a calculating quality that terrified me more than any mindless animal could have. The smaller one suddenly emitted a whistling sound, and the larger one responded with a grunt. Then they both disappeared into the darkness of the forest. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat in the living room, backs against the wall farthest from the windows, listening to the occasional heavy footstep or whistling communication. When something large bumped against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure creak. I clutched our old hunting rifle, knowing it would probably be useless against whatever was out there. As dawn broke, the sounds receded. When full daylight came, I cautiously ventured outside. The area around the cabin was trampled with those same massive footprints. They were everywhere, circling the cabin, approaching the windows, even leading up to our water pump. But what disturbed me most was what I found by our woodpile. The logs had been rearranged, not scattered or knocked over as an animal might do, but deliberately stacked in a different pattern than how I'd left them. 3 large logs had been placed in a triangular formation, with smaller sticks arranged in the center. It looked like the beginning of a campfire setup, but different, strange. There was a sense of intelligence behind it, of communication or marking. I quickly dismantled it, my hands shaking. When I returned inside, Ingrid was packing our bags. "We're leaving," she said, not looking up. "Right now." I didn't argue. We packed quickly, throwing our belongings haphazardly into our suitcases. As we were loading the car, I heard a sharp crack from the forest, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. I looked up to see the undergrowth moving about 100 meters away, something large pushing through the bushes just out of sight. We got in the car, and I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It coughed once, twice, then roared to life. As we sped down the dirt track that led to the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the 2 figures. In daylight, I could make out more details. Shaggy dark hair covering their bodies, massive shoulders, long arms. They were like apes, but larger, more upright. And their faces, what I could see of them, looked almost human-like, but flatter, more primitive, with heavy brow ridges. They watched us go, and I'll never forget the feeling that they understood exactly what was happening, that we were fleeing, that they had driven us away. There was an intelligence in how they stood there, observing our departure, that chilled me to my core. We drove straight back to Stockholm without stopping. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those creatures, about their howls and whistles, about the way they moved with that strange combination of animal power and human-like deliberation. I later heard rumors about other encounters in the area that summer. 2 moose hunters reported their dogs fleeing from something in terror. 2 teenage girls claimed to have seen an ape-like creature while swimming. A woman found similar footprints around her cabin. I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in North America, and what we encountered shares many similarities. The locals in Hälsingland have occasionally mentioned legends of forest creatures they call snowmannen, but these are usually dismissed as old folk tales. We never went back to that cabin. We sold it the following year. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to those woods, of hearing those howls again, of seeing those massive figures silhouetted against the night sky. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. All I know is that for a few terrifying days in the summer of 1985, Ingrid and I weren't alone in that forest. Something was watching us, studying us, communicating about us. Something intelligent enough to arrange logs in a pattern, to coordinate their movements, to understand that we were fleeing from them. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear those whistles and howls in my mind. And I wonder if they're still there, in the forests of Hälsingland, watching and waiting for humans to venture too far into their territory. Story 11. Auge. I've been trying to process what happened to me last month in the Boy High mountain range. I still get chills thinking about it. I need to get this off my chest because I haven't been able to sleep properly since then. Every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes staring back at me from the tree line. I'm a geology student from Auckland, and I've always been fascinated by the Coromandel Peninsula's unique rock formations. For my final year project, I decided to collect samples from various locations in the Boy High range. I'd heard all the stories growing up: the Boy High Bigfoot, the strange creatures in the bush, warnings from the Maori elders. But like most Kiwis my age, I dismissed them as local folklore meant to keep tourists on marked trails. My plan was simple: drive up, set up a small camp, spend the day collecting samples, and then head back the following morning. Nothing fancy, just me, my research gear, and enough supplies for a night in the bush. I'd done solo trips like this before in other parts of New Zealand without any issues. I arrived at the trail entrance around 11 a.m. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, slight breeze. I parked my beat-up Corolla at the small lot near the trailhead and shouldered my backpack. It contained my tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and research equipment. The trail was marked but barely maintained, which was perfect for me. Fewer tourists meant undisturbed geological sites. The first few hours were completely normal. I hiked about 4 kilometers into the range, taking my time, occasionally stopping to examine interesting rock outcroppings. I took samples here and there, making notes in my journal about the locations and compositions. The forest was alive with bird calls, tui, fantails, the occasional wood pigeon. Nothing felt off. Around 3 p.m., I reached a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was relatively flat, near a small stream for water, and had enough open space for my tent while still being sheltered by trees. I set up camp quickly, wanting to make the most of the remaining daylight hours for my research. I decided to explore a bit further, leaving my tent and sleeping gear, but taking my backpack with sample containers and tools. According to my map, there was an interesting rocky outcrop about 1 kilometer further in that supposedly had some unique mineral deposits. I marked my campsite location on my GPS and headed deeper into the bush. The trail started to become less defined as I moved further in. The trees grew denser, blocking out more of the sunlight. It got noticeably cooler and the sounds of birds became less frequent. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I still had plenty of daylight left, but something made me uneasy. It was too quiet. In New Zealand bush, there's always noise. Birds, insects, wind in the trees. But here it was like everything was holding its breath. I nearly turned back, but then I spotted the outcrop I was looking for through a gap in the trees. Just another 100 meters or so. I pressed on, pushing through some dense undergrowth until I reached it. The outcrop was perfect, exposed layers showing exactly what I needed for my research. I set down my pack and got to work, hammering off samples and placing them in labeled containers. I was so focused on my work that I didn't immediately notice the silence had become absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind. When I finally registered the unnatural silence, I froze mid-swing with my geology hammer. That's when I felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. My entire body was screaming at me to run. I slowly turned around, scanning the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. But then I saw it, a slight movement behind a large kauri tree, about 20 meters away. I squinted, thinking it might be a wild pig, or maybe even a lost sheep. But what emerged partly from behind the tree wasn't anything I recognized. At first, I only saw a large, hairy arm gripping the side of the tree. The arm was impossibly long, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. The fingers, God, the fingers were what made my blood run cold. They were easily twice as long as human fingers, ending in what looked like sharp, curved nails or claws. They weren't like any animal paws I'd ever seen. They were, too, deliberate in how they gripped the tree. I stood completely still, hoping whatever it was would leave me alone if I didn't make any sudden movements. Then the creature shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face peering around the tree. It was just for a second, but that image is burned into my memory. Dark, deeply set eyes under a prominent brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, no visible lips, just a slash of a mouth. The face was covered in the same dark hair, but less densely than the arm I'd seen. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there. It was looking at me with purpose, with curiosity or calculation. I don't know how long we stared at each other, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then it made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a hum. It was low and resonant, and I swear it vibrated through the ground into my feet. That's when my paralysis broke. I grabbed my backpack, leaving the rock samples scattered on the ground, and backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree where I'd seen it. When I was about 10 meters away, I heard rustling from multiple directions around me. More than one. There were more of them, moving in the bush around me. I couldn't see them clearly, just glimpses of movement, a flash of dark hair, the occasional crack of a twig. They were circling me. I broke into a run, no longer caring about being careful. I just needed to get back to my campsite and then to my car. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me. The entire time I could hear them moving through the bush alongside me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. They were faster than me, more agile in this environment. They were herding me. The terrifying thing was that they could have caught me at any point. I knew it, and somehow I knew that they knew I knew it. This wasn't a chase, it was something else. A game, a test, whatever it was, I was at their mercy. I somehow made it back to my campsite, my lungs burning, legs shaking. To my horror, everything was trashed. My tent was ripped apart, sleeping bag torn to shreds. My food was gone. But most disturbing of all, my research journal had been placed in the center of the clearing, open to the last page I'd written on, with a perfect mud-covered handprint pressed into the paper. The handprint was massive, easily twice the size of my own hand, with those same long fingers I'd seen gripping the tree. It wasn't random. This was deliberate communication. I didn't stick around to analyze it further. I grabbed what was left of my gear and ran for the trail, heading back toward my car. The sun was getting low now, casting long shadows through the trees. I kept imagining shapes in those shadows, following me, pacing me. About halfway back to the trailhead, I had to stop to catch my breath. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. When I straightened up, I froze again. There, on the trail ahead of me, stood one of them, fully visible in the dying light. It was tall, at least 6 feet, maybe more. Its body proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms hung almost to its knees, massive and corded with muscle under the dark hair. Its legs were shorter, powerful, built for moving quickly through rough terrain. It stood upright but had a slight forward hunch. The head sat low between powerful shoulders, and those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, watched me without blinking. We stood there, staring at each other. I was beyond fear at this point, just numb, accepting that this might be the end. Then it did something that still haunts me. It raised one hand, those long fingers extended, and slowly pointed back the way I had come. Then it pointed at me, then back toward the deeper forest. The message seemed clear. Go back. I shook my head, almost unconsciously. It tilted its head, studying me, then made that same resonant humming sound I'd heard earlier. Immediately, I heard responses from the forest around us, at least 3 or 4 distinct calls answering. Then, it stepped off the trail and into the bush, disappearing instantly despite its size. The trail ahead was clear, but I knew they were still watching, still following. I ran again, no longer caring about noise or stealth. I just ran and ran, until finally, miraculously, I saw my car through the trees. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. As I threw myself inside and slammed the door, I looked back toward the forest. There they were, not just one, but 6 of them, standing at the tree line. Different sizes, what looked like adults and juveniles. A family group. They made no move to approach, just watched silently as I started the car with shaking hands and pulled away. I drove straight back to Auckland that night, too terrified to stop. I haven't told anyone this full story until now. I told my professor I got sick and couldn't complete the fieldwork. I told my roommates I changed my mind about camping alone. But the thing that keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's what happened the day after I got back. When I finally unpacked my tattered backpack, I found one of my sample containers inside. I didn't remember packing it in my panicked flight. Inside wasn't the rock sample I'd been collecting. Instead, there was a small, intricately woven bundle of fern fronds, tree bark, and what looked like animal sinew. Tied in the center was a single, long, dark hair. I keep it hidden in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out just to confirm to myself that I didn't imagine the whole thing. I had it tested by a friend in the biology department, off the record. No questions asked. The hair isn't human. It isn't from any known New Zealand animal either. The DNA sequencing came back inconclusive. Contaminated sample, my friend said. I know what I saw. I know what's still out there in the Boy High range. I don't know if they were warning me away or inviting me back, but I'm never going near that place again. Sometimes at night, I still hear that resonant hum in my dreams, and I wake up feeling like those intelligent, calculating eyes are watching me through my bedroom window. I don't care if people believe me or not. I know what I experienced. The Boy High Bigfoot isn't a myth or a tourist story. They're real, they're intelligent, and for whatever reason, they let me go. I just don't know why, and that's what scares me the most. Story 12. I still can't fully wrap my head around what happened to us at that cabin. My wife Sarah and I bought the place back in 2010, thinking we'd found our little slice of paradise. It was nestled between 2 wooded hillsides in rural Missouri, with a creek that ran down to a small pond that eventually fed into a river about a quarter-mile away. Perfect spot for weekend getaways and eventually retirement. At least that's what we thought. I'm 44. Been a volunteer firefighter for almost 2 decades, and I've spent most of my life outdoors. Hunting, fishing, camping, you name it. I know the woods. I know animal behaviors. At least I thought I did until we moved into that cabin. The weird stuff started about 3 weeks after we moved in. At first, it was just these strange sounds on our metal roof. Ping, ping, ping. Not in any pattern, just random. I figured it was acorns dropping or maybe small branches. No big deal, right? But it kept happening, always, at night and always when we were trying to sleep. After the 3rd night of this, I got fed up. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around the cabin to see what was going on. That's when I noticed small rocks scattered all over the roof. Not pebbles from the driveway, these were creek rocks. Smooth, water-polished stones that couldn't have gotten up there naturally. I collected about a dozen of them that first night. I told Sarah about it, and she suggested maybe neighborhood kids were playing pranks. but our nearest neighbors were over half a mile away, and there weren't many kids in the area. Plus, who'd trudge through the woods at night just to throw rocks on someone's roof? About a week later, the thumping started. Not like the rocks. These were solid thump sounds against the side of the house. The first time it happened, I was watching TV while Sarah was in the bath. The sound was so loud and deliberate that I genuinely thought someone was knocking. I went to the door. Nothing. Checked all around the house with my flashlight. Again, nothing. These thumps would happen roughly twice a week for months. Sometimes just 1 or 2 thumps, sometimes a series of 3 or 4, spaced out by a few seconds. They never seemed to come from the same spot twice. Front wall, back wall, side wall. It was random. And every time I'd check, there would be nobody there. I started keeping a journal of the incidents. Date, time, what we heard, weather conditions. I was trying to find some pattern, some explanation that made sense. Maybe it was the house settling, maybe it was some kind of wildlife, maybe it was the wind causing branches to hit the house. But none of those explanations quite fit what we were experiencing. By winter, I was getting used to the strange noises. They became part of our routine, as weird as that sounds. We'd hear a thump, I'd get up and check, find nothing, and we'd go back to whatever we were doing. Sarah was less comfortable with it than I was, but we both tried to rationalize it away. Then one night in February, everything escalated. We were getting ready for bed when our doorbell rang. It was almost 10 p.m., way too late for casual visitors out here in the sticks. I answered the door to find the Millers, an older couple who lived about half a mile down the road. "Sorry to bother you so late," Mr. Miller said, looking genuinely worried. "But have you heard anyone calling for help?" I told him we hadn't heard anything, and he explained that they'd been hearing what sounded like someone yelling, "Help me!" from the direction of our property for the past half hour. They'd driven over to check if we were okay. I thanked them for their concern and told them I'd take a look around. Called the sheriff's department as a precaution, and when the deputy arrived, I joined him in searching the woods around our property. It was cold, maybe 30 degrees, and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground. Perfect conditions to see footprints if someone had been out there. We spent over an hour searching with flashlights, checking the creek bed, looking in the ravine behind the house, and found absolutely nothing. No footprints except our own. No signs of anyone in distress. The deputy finally concluded it must have been an animal sound that the Millers misinterpreted and headed back to his car. As he was leaving, he said something that stuck with me. "You know, we get a lot of calls like this out here. People hearing strange calls in the woods. Most of the time it's just a bobcat or a fox. They can sound surprisingly human when they want to." I nodded and agreed. But something didn't sit right. The Millers weren't the type to panic over animal sounds. They'd lived here their whole lives. About a week later, Sarah had an experience that changed everything. She'd taken the trash out around dusk, and when she came back in, she was visibly shaken. "Something growled at me," she said, her voice trembling. "From the tree line. It wasn't a dog or a coyote. It was deep, like nothing I've ever heard before." I grabbed my shotgun and went outside immediately. The sun had almost set and shadows were stretching across our yard. I walked toward the trees where Sarah had heard the sound, calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" That's when I heard it too, a deep guttural growl that seemed to reverberate in my chest, followed by several huffing sounds. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life. I've heard bears, cougars, wolves, coyotes, you name it. This wasn't like any of those. It was deeper, more deliberate somehow. I raised my shotgun and fired a warning shot into the air. The woods went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just total, unnatural silence. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and went back inside. Sarah and I didn't sleep much that night. We kept the shotgun by the bed and took turns staying awake, listening. The growl didn't return, but around 3 a.m., we both heard a series of thumps on the roof again. This time, they sounded like heavy footsteps crossing from one side to the other. The next morning, I called a buddy from the fire department who was also a game warden. I described what we'd heard, and he suggested it might be a black bear, though they weren't common in our specific area. He promised to come by the next day and look for tracks. He found nothing conclusive, just some broken branches and what might have been large footprints. But the ground was too hard to show clear impressions. He set up a trail camera on the edge of our property, facing the woods where we'd heard the growl. For a few weeks, things were quieter. The rock throwing stopped. The thumps became less frequent. We checked the trail camera weekly, but only caught deer, raccoons, and once a bobcat. Nothing unusual. Then came that day in June, a day I'll never forget as long as I live. Sarah and I were picking spinach from our garden boxes along the driveway. It was a perfect summer day, about 80 degrees, clear sky, light breeze. We were chatting about maybe grilling out later when Sarah suddenly went still, her hand frozen in mid-air. "Don't move," she whispered. I slowly looked up to see what had caught her attention, and there it was, about 30 feet away at the edge of our property where the yard meets the woods. The thing was huge. I'd estimate at least 7.5 feet tall, covered in auburn-colored hair about 4 to 6 inches long. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, maybe 36-48 inches across. The head was large and seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders with no visible neck. The proportions were all wrong for a human, but didn't match any animal I knew either. It was just standing there watching us, not in a threatening way, more like it was curious. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, as casually as you'd turn away from a stranger on the street, it turned and walked down the hill toward the creek. We heard a splash, and then nothing. It was gone. Sarah and I looked at each other, both of us white as sheets. Without a word, we ran through the woods barefoot, trying to catch another glimpse of it. We reached the creek within seconds, but there was no sign of the creature. No wet footprints on the rocks, no broken branches showing its path, nothing. When we finally made it back to the house, we just sat at the kitchen table in shock. Neither of us spoke for a long time. What do you say after seeing something like that? Something that shouldn't exist, but was clearly, undeniably real? "That was a Sasquatch," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't it?" I nodded slowly. I think it was. I've never been one for cryptids or paranormal stuff. I'm practical, logical. But what we saw that day didn't fit into my understanding of the world. It wasn't a bear on its hind legs, wasn't a man in a suit. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. The proportions were impossible for a human. We didn't tell many people. How could we? Who would believe us? The few friends we did tell either thought we were joking or suggested we'd seen a bear. But we know what we saw. The activity continued for another year. More rocks on the roof, more thumps on the walls. Occasionally, we'd hear that deep growl from the woods, but we never saw the creature again while we lived there. Eventually, a logging company bought the land surrounding our property and cleared most of the woods. The strange occurrences stopped almost immediately. I guess whatever it was moved on when its habitat was destroyed. We decided to move away, but kept the property for another year, renting it out to a cousin who never reported anything unusual. 3 months before we finally sold the place, I went back to collect some things we'd stored in the shed. I was loading boxes into my truck when I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I turned toward what was left of the woods and saw it. Not the auburn creature from before, but something different. A large black figure sitting on a pile of cut branches about 40-50 yards away. It had a grayish face and large black eyes that seemed to bore right through me. It kept its head low, glaring at me with a slight side-to-side sway, like a predator sizing up its prey. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then suddenly, it was gone, moving through the thinned woods with incredible speed, leaving only the loud crack of breaking limbs in its wake. I dropped everything, jumped in my truck, and left. Never went back alone after that. We sold the property soon after. The new owners have never contacted us about anything strange, so maybe whatever was there is truly gone now. Or maybe they're experiencing the same things and, like us, are too afraid of sounding crazy to tell anyone. I don't know what we encountered in those woods. I've spent years researching, reading accounts of similar experiences, trying to make sense of it all. Some nights I still wake up to phantom sounds of rocks hitting a metal roof or heavy footsteps crossing overhead. All I know for certain is that something was watching us during our time at that cabin. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was as real as the ground beneath my feet. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling of being watched, and I wonder if it's found me again. Story 13. I've always been a stargazer. There's something so calming about looking up at the night sky and seeing all those stars, knowing how tiny we are in this massive universe. My girlfriend Jen and I would go out stargazing pretty regularly, but I'll never forget what happened at Settles Ford last summer. I'm writing this down because I need to tell someone, and maybe someone else has seen it too. This happened on July 23rd, 2020. We'd been cooped up for months with the whole COVID situation, and we were desperate to get out of the house and do something that felt normal. Stargazing seemed perfect, isolated, outdoors, just us and the night sky. I'd heard Settles Ford Conservation Area in Cass County had minimal light pollution, so we decided to check it out. We arrived around 1 a.m. It was a warm night, but not too humid for Missouri in July. The conservation area has this gravel parking lot with fields stretching out to the east and a thick tree line to the west. It was exactly what we wanted. Remote, quiet, and dark enough to see the stars clearly. I'd brought my telescope, a couple of camping chairs, and my spotlight. It's this really powerful one I got for hunting. Has a zoom lens that can pick up eyeshine from animals at a pretty good distance. I always bring it with me when we're out in remote areas at night. Just a precaution, you know. As soon as we pulled into that gravel lot and turned off the car, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The crickets were chirping, there was a light breeze, everything seemed normal. But I had this weight in my stomach, like when you know something bad is about to happen. I glanced at Jen and could tell she felt it too. She was looking around nervously instead of getting her chair out of the trunk. "You feel that?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I admitted. "Probably just animals nearby or something." I tried to brush it off as nerves. We were in a new place. It was the middle of the night and we were alone. Of course we'd be a little on edge, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to do a quick scan of the area with my spotlight. This is something I always do, check for any wildlife or, honestly, other people who might be out there. The conservation area is public land, and you never know who might be camping or hunting illegally. I swept the beam across the field to the east of us. The grass was maybe a foot and a half tall at most. You could clearly see across it to where it eventually met another tree line maybe a couple 100 yards away. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards out in the field, my light caught something white. At first I thought it might be a deer. They often freeze in headlights. But as soon as I focused the beam on it, I knew it wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was standing upright, tall, really tall. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet, probably taller. It was slender, almost unnaturally so, and completely white. Not like clothing white, but a dull, matte white like paper or, I don't know, like something bleached by the sun. The proportions were just wrong. The worst part was its head. It didn't seem to have a neck at all. The head just sat directly on its shoulders. I couldn't make out any features on the face, if it even had one. It was too far away, and my light was just catching the outline of it. I held the beam on it for maybe 3 seconds, though it felt much longer. Then it started moving. It didn't turn toward the trees. It just started gliding in that direction. I say gliding because that's exactly what it looked like. Its arms stayed perfectly still at its sides. It didn't look like it was walking or running. It was like it was floating just above the grass, moving at a steady pace toward the tree line to the west. "Get in the car," I told Jen, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get in the car right now." She must have heard the urgency in my voice because she didn't ask questions. We both scrambled back into the car, and I locked the doors. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. "What is it? What did you see?" Jen was asking, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I thought it was a person at first, but..." And that's when it hit me. Why would anyone be standing out in a field dressed in white at 1 a.m.? It made no sense. No one would be out there. And the way it moved wasn't human. Part of me, the stupid, curious part, wanted to know more. I started the car and drove slowly down the gravel road that curved around the western edge of the field, in the direction where the figure had been heading. I kept my high beams on, scanning the trees. That's when we noticed the fog. It seemed to come out of nowhere, thick and heavy, limiting our visibility to maybe 40 feet ahead of us. I swear it wasn't foggy when we arrived just minutes earlier. It was like the fog was following that thing, or maybe the thing had brought it with it. "Turn around," Jen whispered. "Please, let's just go." I wanted to argue, to keep looking, but the fear churning in my gut won out. I did a quick 3-point turn and headed back toward the main road as fast as I dared on the gravel. As we passed the spot where we'd initially parked, I slowed down slightly, sweeping my headlights across the field one more time. Nothing. Whatever it was had vanished, either into the trees or into the fog that was now creeping across the field. The drive home was silent, except for our breathing. Jen was clutching her seatbelt so tightly her knuckles were white. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that white figure following us somehow. "What was that thing?" Jen finally asked when we were about halfway home. "I don't know," I admitted. "It looked almost human, but..." "Wrong. It wasn't human," she said with complete certainty. "No human is that tall or moves like that." I couldn't disagree with her. When I got home, I immediately went online to search for any similar sightings in the area. I found a few vague stories about strange lights and unexplained noises, but nothing that matched what we'd seen. I even checked local news to see if there had been any reports of missing persons or unusual activities around Settles Ford. Nothing. I've been back to that conservation area 3 times since then, always during daylight. I've walked that field, looked for any signs of something, anything that could explain what we saw. I've found nothing. The place looks completely normal in the daylight, just a field next to some woods in rural Missouri. But I haven't been back at night. I can't bring myself to do it. Every time I think about it, I remember that white figure gliding across the field, its head sitting wrong on its shoulders, and that immediate visceral fear I felt when my light found it in the darkness. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of rare animal standing on its hind legs. Maybe the fog and darkness played tricks on my eyes. But none of those explanations feel right. Jen and I both saw it, and we both felt that same instinctive fear. What keeps me up at night is wondering, what if it's still out there? What if it's always been out there? And people just don't usually go to Settles Ford at 1 a.m. with a powerful spotlight. How many other things might be out there in the dark that we don't know about? And the worst thought of all, what would have happened if we had arrived just a few minutes later and encountered it in the parking lot instead of safely 50 yards away across an open field? I still go stargazing, but never alone, and never at Settles Ford. Some nights when I'm looking up at the stars, I can't help but wonder if something is looking back at me from the darkness between them. I don't have any explanation for what we saw that night. I can't fit it into any category of known animals or natural phenomena. All I know is that for those few seconds, when my light illuminated that white figure in the field, I felt a fear more primal and deep than anything I've ever experienced. It was the kind of fear that bypasses your rational mind and speaks directly to something ancient in your DNA that says, danger, run. So that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I can believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. And I know that I'll never look at a dark field the same way again. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. In them, I'm standing in that field at Settles Ford, alone. The fog is rolling in, and I can feel something watching me from the tree line, something tall and white and wrong. And no matter how fast I run, I can sense it gliding behind me, getting closer and closer. I always wake up before it catches me, at least so far. Story 14. I never thought I'd actually type this out, but a post I read tonight brought back memories that haven't let me sleep in peace for years. I've only told this story to close friends and family who understand what growing up in rural West Virginia means. Some won't believe me, and that's fine. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. I grew up in a small community nestled in the hills of West Virginia, about 20 miles from the nearest actual town. Our house sat at the edge of woods that seemed to stretch forever, and like most kids in the area, I spent every daylight hour I could exploring those trees, creeks, and ridges. My dad taught me how to track animals, how to move quietly, and which berries were safe to eat. Those woods were my playground, my refuge, my second home. But there was this one section, up past the old Whitaker property, that never felt right. Even on bright summer days, something about that ridge made the hair on my neck stand up. The trees grew closer together there, blocking out more light than seemed natural. The ground felt wrong somehow, like it wasn't welcoming your footsteps. Dad called it dead ground, said some places just carry bad energy. As a kid I'd roll my eyes, but I never lingered there long. Everyone in our community knew about the white thing. It wasn't something adults talked about directly, more like something mentioned in hushed tones when they thought we kids weren't listening. But we had our own stories, passed down from older siblings or cousins. Some said it was a mountain lion with albinism. Others swore it was something that escaped from a government lab. My cousin Jesse insisted it was a Wendigo after he found some old book on Native American legends. Whatever it was, we all knew its sounds. From late fall through winter, when the trees were bare and sound carried further through the hills, we'd sometimes hear it. The screams would echo through the valleys, bouncing between ridges until you couldn't tell where they originated. Sometimes it sounded almost like a woman crying out, but too loud, too sustained to be human. Other times, it was deeper, more guttural, halfway between a mountain lion's scream and a bear's growl, but somehow different from both. Dad would always make some comment about that darn mountain lion when we heard it, but his eyes would drift toward his shotgun propped by the door, and he'd check the locks twice those nights. There was an old strip mine road about a mile from our house that made for perfect sledding in winter. It curved down the hillside for almost half a mile, steep enough for serious speed but wide enough that you wouldn't crash into trees if you wiped out. We'd spend hours there after school, and all day on weekends when snow was good. This happened in late January when I was 10. We'd had a heavy snow followed by a slight thaw and then a hard freeze, creating the perfect sledding conditions. Me, my 12-year-old sister Amber, the Ryan sisters, around 15, 16, and the 3 Henderson boys, the youngest was 14, oldest maybe 17, had been sledding all afternoon. We'd built a good-sized bonfire at the top of the hill where we could warm up between runs and dry out wet gloves. Most of the younger kids had gone home as darkness fell. but our group decided to stay for a few more runs. Mom knew I was with Amber and the older kids, and we were expected back before 8. The fire was still going strong, and the sledding was too good to quit. It must have been around 7 p.m. The air had that special winter clarity where sound travels forever. Our breath puffed out in clouds illuminated by the nearly full moon reflecting off the snow. Everything was that blue-white winter night color, crisp and clean. We'd just finished what we decided would be our final run and were walking back up the hill together, talking about who'd gone fastest and who'd wiped out worse that day. We were about 125 yards from the fire, strung out along the path we'd packed down from our repeated trips when I heard it. The scream stopped my heart. I'm not being dramatic. I physically felt my chest seize up. It wasn't like the distant echoes we'd heard before. This was close, too close, and so loud it felt like it was inside my head. Every one of us froze, mid-step. Cassie, the older Ryan's sister, whispered, "What the f—" But then her voice dried up. We all turned toward the fire at the same moment. Standing there, illuminated by flames, was something I still struggled to describe accurately. It was white, not dirty white or cream, but the kind of white that hurts your eyes in direct sunlight. It stood upright on 2 legs, but they weren't shaped right. The joints bent slightly wrong. It was massive, towering over our bonfire, which was built from logs stacked almost 4 feet high. I can't tell you exactly how tall it was, because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. 7 feet? 8? Maybe more. Its arms hung too long, past where its knees should be. Its head was shaped wrong, elongated and somehow both canine and not. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, thank God. But I could see enough to know it was looking directly at us. For 3 heartbeats, everything was silent. Then it opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't the scream from before. This was deeper, angrier, a growl that built into something I can only describe as hatred given voice. It echoed off the hillside behind us, surrounding us with its fury. Megan Ryan collapsed, just straight dropped to the snow. Her sister started screaming. The oldest Henderson boy, Tyler, snapped out of it first. He grabbed Megan under the arms while his brother Matt grabbed her legs. They started backing down the hill, not taking their eyes off the thing by the fire. "Move!" my sister hissed, yanking my coat sleeve so hard it tore. "Move now!" We didn't run at first. Something instinctual told us not to. We backed away, stumbling in the deep snow beside our packed trail. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were our ragged breathing and Cassie's quiet sobbing. The creature stepped forward, circling our fire, head tilted like it was studying us. The firelight threw its shadow across the snow, impossibly long and distorted. Then it moved toward the trail we'd created up the hill. "Run!" Tyler shouted, and suddenly we were scrambling backward, turning, slipping in the snow as we tried to flee downhill. I fell twice, snow filling my coat collar and sleeves. Amber yanked me up each time. The Henderson boys were ahead with Megan, who'd regained consciousness and was now moving on her own. Cassie kept looking back over her shoulder, which caused her to trip repeatedly. I made the mistake of looking back once. The thing was following, moving with an awkward loping gait that covered ground faster than seemed possible. It wasn't running exactly, more like each step carried it unnaturally far. Its movements were jerky, almost like stop-motion animation, and it was gaining on us. Ahead, I could see the lights of houses at the base of the hill. So close, maybe 400 yards. The creature let out another scream. This one felt different, frustrated, angry that we were getting away. The sound physically hurt my ears. The youngest Henderson boy, Jake, started crying, not sobbing, just silent tears freezing on his face as he ran. I remember that detail so clearly. We reached the bottom of the hill and kept running across Old Man Miller's field toward the road where our houses were clustered. I risked another glance back. The creature had stopped at the tree line. It stood there, white against the darkness, watching us flee. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes tracking us. It let out one final scream. This one almost sounded mocking, before melting back into the darkness between the trees. We burst into our yard, all of us gasping and crying. Dad was already standing on the back porch, shotgun in hand, staring up at the hillside where the screams had come from. "Inside!" he barked when he saw us. "All of you, now!" We piled into the kitchen, shivering more from terror than cold. Mom wrapped blankets around us, while Dad made calls to the Henderson and Ryan parents. When everyone had calmed down enough to speak clearly, we told them what we'd seen. I expected Dad to dismiss it, to say it was just shadows and fear playing tricks on our minds. Instead, his face went grey. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "You actually saw it," he said quietly. Not a question. Mom shot him a warning look, but he shook his head slightly. "They need to know, Ellen, if they've seen it." He told us then that the white thing had been spotted in these hills since his grandfather's time. Most people went their whole lives just hearing it. A few claimed to have glimpsed it through trees or in the distance. Almost no one had seen it up close. "Bill Tanner said he shot at one 3 years back," Dad said. 3 times with his .22. Said it didn't even flinch, just looked at him like he was an annoying bug. Dad made us promise never to go up to the sledding hill after dark again. It was a promise I had absolutely no trouble keeping. The Henderson boys' father organized a group of men to go up to the hill the next morning. They found our fire pit kicked apart, with tracks around it that they couldn't identify. Not bear, not mountain lion, not anything they recognized. The tracks followed our trail down the hill about halfway, before veering off into the deeper woods toward that bad ridge. I've spent my whole adult life trying to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a sick prank. Maybe it was some kind of rare animal with a disease that made it behave strangely. Maybe it was mass hysteria triggered by the stories we'd all grown up hearing. But then I remember how it moved, how it sounded, the wrongness of its proportions, the intelligence in the way it herded us down that hill. I still love the woods, still hunt, still hike whenever I get the chance. But I never stay out after dark in unfamiliar territory. And to this day, I can't stand the sound of a woman screaming, even in movies. It sends me right back to that hillside, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I do, just to prove to myself I didn't imagine it. A much bigger part prays I never do. I don't know what we saw that night. I just know that 30 years later, I still wake up sometimes with that scream echoing in my head and the image of something white watching me from beside a fire. Story 15. I've been hesitating to share this for years because I know how it sounds. Trust me, I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it. But I can't keep this bottled up anymore, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It all started on June 24th, 2007. I was 15 at the time, spending a week at my family's cabin in Juniata County, Pennsylvania. The cabin sits near the Snyder County border, not far from Bald Eagle State Park. We'd had this place since before I was born. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a kitchen, living room, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom. The best part about it was the location. Totally isolated with a beautiful creek running right alongside it. That day, my parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone at the cabin. I didn't have my driver's license yet, so I was stuck there by myself for a few hours. It was around midday, probably noon or so, and the June heat was getting to me. I decided to walk upstream along the creek to cool off. The water was only about knee-deep, perfect for wading. Our property had this small handmade rock dam about 50 feet upstream from the cabin, just rocks piled up to create a deeper swimming hole. The cabin side of the creek had all these tall, evergreen trees growing right to the edge, creating this wall of green. The opposite bank was more open, with mixed forest, starting about 20 feet back from the water. I was just messing around in the creek, flipping over rocks looking for crayfish like I'd done 100 times before. But then this weird feeling washed over me. I can't really explain it, but it felt like someone had their eyes fixed right on me. Not just looking, but staring. The kind of stare that makes the hair on your neck stand up. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe my parents had come back early. I looked back toward the cabin, but their car wasn't there. The feeling got stronger, almost like a physical pressure. I scanned the trees on the other side of the creek, and that's when I saw her. Between two large oak trees, maybe 40 yards away, stood what I can only describe as a female Sasquatch. She was tall, at least 7 feet, with a slender build compared to what you'd expect, covered in dark brown hair. But what made my heart stop was that she was holding something, a smaller version of herself, a baby or young Sasquatch cradled in her arms. I froze completely, not out of fear exactly, but from shock. She didn't move either. We just stared at each other. Her eyes didn't have that animal look. There was something eerily intelligent there, something that said she was sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat. The strangest part was that I didn't feel threatened by her. But then the feeling of being watched intensified, like there were now multiple sets of eyes on me. Slowly, I turned my head upstream, and that's when true fear hit me. About 30 yards upstream, partially hidden by a fallen tree, was an enormous male Sasquatch. If the female was 7 feet, this thing was easily 8 or 9 feet tall. It had jet-black fur covering its entire body, and its proportions were just wrong. Massive shoulders that would make an NFL linebacker look small, incredibly long arms, and legs like tree trunks. Its head is what really got to me, though. It wasn't shaped like the cone head you see in those famous Bigfoot photos. Instead, it had this blocky, almost rectangular head that looked too small for its massive body. And its eyes, God, those eyes, they were this copper-red color with orange streaks running through them, sunken deep under a thick brow ridge. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either, somewhere horrifyingly in between. The intensity of its stare felt physical, like it was burning into me. I've never felt anything like it before or since. It wasn't just looking at me, it was seeing through me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me standing knee-deep in the creek, the female with her young one across the way, and this alpha male upstream. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Time kind of froze. Then the male shifted its weight. It was just a slight movement, but it broke the spell. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off either of them, until I felt I was far enough to turn and walk quickly, not run, back to the cabin. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel those eyes tracking me the entire way. When I got inside, I locked the door and sat on the couch, trying to process what I'd just seen. I kept expecting them to approach the cabin, but they never did. When my parents returned, I didn't tell them. I couldn't. They would have thought I was making it up or had seen some bears. But I know what bears look like. These weren't bears. For the rest of that trip, I didn't go back to that part of the creek. I stayed close to the cabin or went with my parents when they went out. But here's the crazy thing. I didn't feel unwelcome. It was more like I had accidentally stumbled into someone's living room, and they were just as surprised to see me as I was to see them. We continued to visit the cabin several times each year, and for a while I didn't see them again. I was careful, always looking around, always aware, but nothing happened. After a couple of years, I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Then, when I was about 17, so this would have been around 2009, I had my second encounter. It was late July, scorching hot. I'd gained some confidence since that first sighting and had started exploring the creek again. I was cooling off in that same swimming hole by the rock dam, floating on my back and looking up at the sky. I got that same prickly feeling on the back of my neck. Without moving my body, I tilted my head back to look upstream, and there he was, the same massive male Sasquatch, sitting on a large flat rock along the bank about 60 feet away from me. He wasn't hiding this time. He was just sitting there, watching me. His feet were dangling in the water. I slowly righted myself in the water, ready to bolt if needed. But again, there was no aggression, just observation. His copper-red eyes remained fixed on me, but the deadly intensity I'd felt before was gone. It was more like curiosity. After a few moments, I decided to test something. I raised my hand slowly and gave a small wave. The creature didn't wave back, but its head tilted slightly, like a dog trying to understand a new command. Then, without any warning, it stood up. God, it was huge, and simply walked into the tree line, disappearing in seconds despite its size. That's when it hit me that over these years they'd been watching me, figuring out that I wasn't a threat. I was just the weird, hairless creature that showed up sometimes at the wooden structure by their creek. I've been back to the cabin dozens of times since then, and I've caught glimpses of them occasionally, a flash of movement in the trees, the feeling of being watched. But they always kept their distance, and so did I. It was like we had an unspoken agreement. Until last month, that is. I'm 31 now, and I still visit the cabin whenever I can. Most of my family has lost interest in the place, so I often go alone for weekends of fishing and hiking. This particular weekend in June, I arrived Friday evening. It was a beautiful night, and after unpacking I made dinner and sat at the kitchen table listening to music on my portable speaker. It was around 9 p.m. The sun had just set, and I was scrolling through my phone while some classic rock played at a moderate volume. Then it happened. A tremendous thud against the side of the cabin. The entire structure shook, rattling dishes in the cupboards. It wasn't like a branch falling or an animal bumping into the wall. It was deliberate, like someone had taken a battering ram to the side of the cabin. I immediately hit pause on my music. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a voice outside the kitchen window. This wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. The best way I can describe it is what some researchers call samurai chatter, a series of rapid clicks, whoops, and guttural sounds that somehow formed a pattern that felt like speech. It wasn't random animal noises. It had syntax and rhythm. It was communication, and it was coming from something standing right outside my window. I couldn't move. I barely breathed. The chattering continued for maybe 15-20 seconds, with pauses as if waiting for a response. Then came a lower, sustained vocalization, almost like a note held on a didgeridoo, but organic and throaty. Then, silence. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to turn on the outside light and peek through the blinds. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see, but on the ground directly below the window was a freshly broken branch about 3 feet long, not from any tree that grew near the cabin. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lights on and sat in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. On the side where I'd heard the thud, I found a dent in the wooden siding about 7 feet up, too high for any normal person to make without a ladder. And leading away from that spot toward the tree line were several broken ferns and bent saplings, as if something very large had moved through there in a hurry. I spent the rest of the weekend indoors, only venturing out to my car when it was time to leave on Sunday. As I was packing up, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive figure watching me. But there was nothing. The weird thing is, I don't feel threatened by what happened. It felt more like a greeting, or maybe a warning about the music. I honestly don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that after all these years of passive observation, one of them decided to initiate contact. I'm heading back to the cabin next month. Part of me is terrified, but another part is intensely curious. What did it want to tell me? Was it the same male I saw all those years ago? Has it been watching me grow up during my visits to the cabin? I've read about other Sasquatch encounters, but most involve fleeting glimpses or intimidation behaviors. This feels different, like some kind of long-term coexistence where they've gradually accepted my periodic presence in their territory. I don't have any answers, just more questions. But I know what I saw and what I heard. Those eyes, that impossible physique, that otherworldly language, these weren't bears or people in costumes. They were something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but clearly does. I've never told anyone in my family about these encounters. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But I needed to share this somewhere with people who might understand or who might have experienced something similar. All I know is that next time I'm at the cabin, I'll be keeping the music turned down, and maybe, just maybe, I'll try saying hello back.